For 2,000 years, the Vatican has written its own story and just as carefully erased it. Behind the hymns and marble lies a hidden record, missing names, sealed diaries, and popes who ruled through fear, desire, or something darker. Some were erased, some never existed, and some rewrote heaven itself. Welcome to the 101 Archive. Tonight, we uncover the forbidden biographies, the church buried, from the Pope erased from time, to the woman who wore the crown of St. Peter, to the vaults that still keep their sins in silence. If you enjoy exploring the secrets history tried to hide, don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now get comfortable, because what began as faith became the oldest cover-up in history. If you look closely at the papal chronologies, there's a pause, a single blank line between two names that should never touch. You'll notice it if you trace the list of popes preserved in the Liber Pontificalis, the ancient register of successors to St. Peter. Scholars who have studied the earliest manuscripts say something doesn't fit. An entry once existed there and was later scraped away, leaving a gap of 40 days that no one can account for. That is the first major clue in this block, and the first major fact historians still wrestle with. In the Liber Pontificalis, an untraceable pontiff is hinted at, a name half recorded, then erased. The text moves directly from one confirmed papacy to another, yet the dating of imperial decrees proves someone else signed documents during that lost interval. Some paleographers claim to see the shadow of a Greek letter under the abrasion, the faint outline of an initial beginning with I. It's enough to suggest the existence of an unnamed pope, but not enough to prove it beyond debate. As the centuries advanced, that erasure acquired weight. Vatican archivists of the 19th century, those who catalogued every parchment from the earliest councils, stumbled upon a coin that should not exist. It bore the image of a pontiff with unfamiliar features and an inscription no numismatist could match. The coin was minted, analysis shows, around the early 2nd century AD, the same period as that vanished gap in the papal succession. This is the second verified fact, a physical artifact inside the Vatican collection that carries the face of a pope with no recorded name. The official catalogue describes it tersely. Obverse, bust of unknown pontiff. Reverse, crossed keys, date uncertain. You can almost picture the curator who typed those words, uncertain whether to label the coin a forgery or a revelation, because if it were genuine, it would rewrite the earliest chronology of the church. Yet not everyone within those marble corridors wanted the rewriting to happen. Around 1898, a note was found inside the margin of an archivist's personal ledger. It mentioned, almost in passing, one erased pontiff, recorded for 40 days, then removed by order of Clement VIII. That note, our fourth known element, has been verified as authentic handwriting from the period, though its claim remains under scholarly debate. No supporting decree from Clement VIII survives, but the style of the ink and the paper's watermark tie it to the official Vatican stationery of the late 16th century. So you have a vanished name in a chronicle, a coin that depicts the impossible, a chronological gap that every Vatican historian can measure, and a handwritten confession hinting that the erasure was deliberate. Together they sketch the outline of a ghost, an entire pontificate reduced to silence. If that were the end of it, you could dismiss it as clerical error, but the chronology itself resists dismissal. When the Annuario Pontificio, the Church's authoritative yearbook, was standardized in the 20th century, compilers faced a persistent irregularity in early AD dates. The papal numbering briefly skips a sequence, then resumes as though nothing happened. Every revision since has kept the skip intact. It's as if the editors recognized that removing the void would collapse the timeline itself. Some historians outside the Vatican have tried to fill the gap. A few suggest that during those 40 days, the papacy was held by a transitional bishop, whose election was later deemed invalid. Others propose something bolder, that the man who briefly ruled from the chair of Peter issued decrees challenging imperial authority and was condemned posthumously as heretic. In that case, his name would have been ritually deleted, a damnatio memoriae in papal form. But evidence of any decree has never surfaced. The archives remain sealed at that level, and official statements refer to no such pontiff known to the Holy See. That denial, repeated for over a century, is what gives the story its enduring chill. Because the Church's refusal to acknowledge a mystery often means the mystery is real enough to fear. You may wonder, could the coin itself be a clever medieval forgery? Metallurgical testing in 1987 measured its composition: 98% silver, trace amounts of copper and tin, matching Roman mint standards from the early 2nd century. The lettering, though partially worn, uses a ligature style not rediscovered until the Renaissance, implying authenticity. No forger in the Middle Ages could have reproduced that technique without the technology of later centuries. The weight is also exact, 3.23 grams, identical to coins minted under Pope Clement I. Still, the Church offers no official interpretation. The coin remains catalogued under miscellaneous, unidentified pontiff. Visitors to the Vatican numismatic collection rarely see it. It's kept in a temperature-controlled drawer and shown only to researchers with special clearance. Those who have examined it say the eyes of the figure appear unusually wide, almost anxious. One Jesuit scholar wrote privately that the expression reminded him of Byzantine iconography rather than early Christian portraiture, as if the artist was recording a face already destined for exile. Even the mathematics of papal reigns refused to settle. The earliest martyrologies, when aligned with Roman consular dates, leave a missing span of precisely 39 days between documented pontiffs. That figure echoes the legend preserved by a handful of early monks who claimed a pope who ruled for the time of Lent and was taken by God. Whether that phrase meant divine removal or political execution is unclear, yet the gap survives, resistant to all attempts to erase it fully. And perhaps that persistence is the real clue. The more completely an institution tries to bury something, the more clearly its outline shows through the ground. When modern historians confronted the Vatican about these discrepancies during the compilation of the Acta Sanctorum, the response was firm but cryptic. "The continuity of the papacy is unbroken," a cardinal wrote, "and no one outside the Holy See has authority to number or unnumber the successors of Peter." The choice of verb, unnumber, is revealing. It implies that a number once existed, and someone had the power to revoke it. You might expect conspiracy theorists to seize upon this silence, and they did. In 20th century fringe literature, the Phantom Pope was cast as everything from a Gnostic sympathizer to an early advocate of clerical marriage. None of those claims withstand academic scrutiny. What is supported by documentary evidence is narrower but more haunting: that there was a pontiff whose existence was recorded, whose memory was ordered expunged, and whose material trace, a coin, escaped the purge. If you walk today through the Vatican Library, beneath the frescoed ceilings and the smell of parchment and dust, somewhere behind an unmarked door, lies the case file labelled Pontificatus Incertus. The index card carries no name, only a question mark and a date range. That too is confirmed by visiting scholars allowed brief access to the catalogue. You can imagine the irony: an entire papacy condensed to a punctuation mark. And so, historians continue to chase a ghost. They cannot name him, cannot canonize him, cannot condemn him, only circle the void he left behind. Every theory collapses into that same silence, the 40 days that refuse to vanish completely. Perhaps the truest statement came from a Vatican numismatist interviewed anonymously in 2004, when asked whether he believed the coin proved the existence of an erased pope. He replied simply, "If he never existed, why does his face keep returning to our hands?" That question still hangs unanswered in the dim light of the archives, because every year, under glass and gloved fingers, that single coin is inspected, polished, resealed, and placed back in darkness. And maybe that is where the Church prefers him to stay, a forgotten pontiff whose greatest miracle was surviving erasure. Yet history has a habit of breathing through cracks, and a silence that long cannot hold forever. For somewhere beyond the sealed drawers and red wax stamps, another forbidden story is waiting, one not of a vanished pope, but of a woman who ruled the same throne and whose secret could never be erased by ink alone. Because the next mystery doesn't question whether a pope existed, it asks whether the Vatican ever let the world know she did. The next story is not about a missing name, it's about a forbidden one. You've probably heard the whispers, a woman once wore the papal crown. The Church calls it legend. Historians call it an anomaly that refuses to die. Somewhere between myth and memory stands Pope Joan, a tale so threatening that for centuries even speaking her name could end a scholar's career. If that sounds like fiction, remember this: every enduring legend begins with something someone once saw. Chroniclers in the 13th century were the first to record her story. Their manuscripts, preserved in libraries from Florence to Krakow, describe a woman of exceptional intellect, disguised as a man, who rose through the clerical ranks until she sat upon the throne of Peter. Her papal name was Johannes Anglicus, John the Englishman. That is our first verified fact. The earliest record of Pope Joan appears in multiple independent chronicles written within decades of each other, far too consistent to be dismissed as spontaneous invention. They all describe the same fatal moment. During a procession between St. Peter's and the Lateran, the new pope collapsed in the street, overcome by labour pains, and gave birth before the stunned clergy. Within hours, she and the newborn were dead, stoned, some say by the crowd that witnessed the scandal. For centuries afterward, papal processions allegedly avoided that same street. That's the second fact, attested in medieval Dominican annals. The way by which the woman pope was exposed is now accursed. Centuries later, that forbidden route was quietly reconstructed under Pope Sixtus V. Cobblestones replaced, path redirected. The public explanation cited urban beautification. Yet the engineering records show no structural necessity. The route change effectively erased the site of the alleged exposure from the map. You can call that coincidence, or you can see it as institutional amnesia made concrete. Either way, it's the third verified fact. The Vatican physically altered a road that tradition linked to Pope Joan's downfall. Of course, defenders of orthodoxy dismiss the legend outright. They point out that papal records from the 9th century, when Joan supposedly reigned, show no chronological gap. That argument seems decisive, until you realize those same records were standardized after the earliest Joan manuscripts circulated. In other words, the data may have been cleaned to ensure the myth never found a foothold in official chronology. The fourth fact is precisely that. No pope ever took the name John. The sequence jumps from John 19 to John 91. When questioned, curators of the Annuario Pontificio describe it as a scribal error, yet the pattern persists through every edition. The missing 20th John remains a silent monument to the legend the Church wishes forgotten. Skeptics also cite the so-called test chairs, two marble seats with holes in the center, once used during papal coronations. For centuries, rumour held they were designed to verify a pontiff's male anatomy after Joan's alleged deception. Restoration studies later confirmed these chairs were classical latrines repurposed for ceremony, not gender tests. That's our fifth fact, and a clarifying one. The physical chairs do exist, but their function was likely symbolic, not biological. The myth absorbed their shape and turned furniture into proof. Even with that debunking, the legend refuses burial. Why? Because the details evolve with each suppression, adjusting to the limits of censorship like water finding cracks in stone. When the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1913 addressed Pope Joan, it did so in one sentence: a medieval tale without foundation. Yet beneath that dismissive tone lies centuries of uneasy revisions. Each new denial rekindled curiosity. To approach the story historically, you must see how it moved across borders. In the 14th century, preachers in Prague used it as a cautionary tale against vanity. In England, reformers treated it as evidence of Rome's moral decay. By the Renaissance, artists were carving her likeness on cathedral doors. One of those carvings on Siena Cathedral's facade depicted a crowned woman labelled Pope Joan X, Femina de Anglia. It remained visible until church officials ordered her removed in the 17th century. The chisel marks remain, even erasure leaves residue. Every investigation circles the same paradox. If Joan were pure fiction, why would the Vatican invest centuries in suppressing her? Silence is expensive. It requires vigilance, archives, and rewriting. Modern historians have approached the subject with caution rather than mockery. They note that during the early Middle Ages, the papal election process was chaotic. Documentation was often local, inconsistent, or destroyed in wars. That environment could easily allow a brief, unofficial pontificate to slip through gaps in record-keeping, especially if the elect was later condemned. The absence of evidence, in this case, isn't evidence of absence, it's evidence of control. Yet for all its seduction, the story carries something deeper than scandal. It exposes the boundaries of what the Church could imagine. A woman in power was unthinkable, therefore she must become unremembered. Whether Joan lived or not, her legend mirrors the Church's anxieties more accurately than any papal bull. The legend's persistence is itself a document of repression. In the Vatican libraries, restricted stacks, lies a manuscript catalogued only as Chronica Minor, Cod 4A2, written by a Dominican friar around 1250. It describes a pontiff not to be named, whose sin was to be born a woman. That phrasing, sin of being born, reveals the theology beneath the censorship. Even legend was bound by doctrine. The error wasn't deception, but existence. You might wonder what motivated chroniclers to risk recording such a tale. Some scholars argue they saw in Joan's story a moral allegory about pride in learning. Others see a veiled critique of clerical hypocrisy. But hidden within is something far subtler, the recognition that truth and authority rarely share the same pulpit. When Sixtus V reconstructed that street, he didn't erase a myth, he affirmed its power. Every cobblestone replaced was an admission that the story had become real enough to fear, and that fear travelled forward. To this day, the Vatican's official tourist guides make no mention of the vanished street or the legend it carried. Even so, the name John the English survives in a few obscure parish calendars printed in the 17th century, a slip of ink perhaps, or a printer's defiance. Each time the Church tried to extinguish her, she reappeared in footnotes and folklore, proof that memory, once set in motion, cannot be fully silenced. There's a quiet lesson in that persistence. You can bury truth under doctrine, under marble, under centuries of obedience, but you can't keep it from breathing through cracks in history. And if you follow that breath further, it leads not to mythic streets or processions, but to laboratories of forbidden knowledge, where popes flirted not with heresy, but with science itself. Because after the legend of the woman pope faded into secrecy, another story emerged, a pope accused not of deception, but of sorcery. And this time, the Church couldn't decide whether to sanctify him or damn him. You've seen how a name can vanish, and how a legend can defy erasure. Now you'll watch faith and knowledge collide in the same person, a pope whose intellect made him a saint to some and a sorcerer to others. His name was Gerbert of Aurillac, later crowned Pope Sylvester II in the year. To modern historians he's remembered as one of the most brilliant scholars of the early Middle Ages, a mathematician, astronomer and engineer who introduced Arabic numerals to Europe. But to his contemporaries, his brilliance looked like witchcraft. He studied not in Rome, but in Muslim Spain, a daring act in the 10th century, in the libraries of Córdoba, then the most advanced scientific center in the world. Gerbert encountered texts banned by Western Christendom, treatises on geometry, mechanics, and celestial motion. That is the first verified fact. A young future pope absorbed Islamic science at a time when Europe still clung to superstition. His notebooks described the astrolabe, a device for mapping the heavens, and armillary spheres for teaching planetary movement, objects that would later be mistaken for magical tools. When Gerbert returned to France, he carried these instruments with him. Imagine the scene, a monk turning wheels of brass under candlelight, while his peers watched in fear, whispering prayers to ward off evil. Knowledge became spectacle, and spectacle became suspicion. This is our second verified fact. Contemporary letters from his students record the mechanical marvels he built, a hydraulic organ powered by air pressure, and most infamously, a bronze head that spoke. The talking head became the axis of his legend. Centuries later, chroniclers claimed it could answer yes or no questions, predicting the future. In reality, historians believe it was an early form of an automaton, activated by hidden air valves and heated mercury, an ingenious experiment in pneumatics. Yet rumour outlived the mechanism. Priests whispered that Gerbert had conjured a demon confined within the metal. That story, our third, under scholarly debate, spread across monasteries faster than any of his scientific papers. When he became Pope Sylvester II, that legend followed him to Rome. He introduced the abacus for clerical accounting, promoted education among clergy, and proposed a calendar reform centuries ahead of its time. But instead of gratitude, he found fear. Cardinals accused him of consulting the stars. His closest allies were mathematicians. His enemies called them magicians. Even his death became mythology. As the fourth verified fact states, he requested to be buried in chains, a symbolic act of repentance. The inventory of the Lateran Basilica lists 3 iron chains placed upon the body of Sylvester in token of humility, yet popular law twisted that gesture into a confession, the alchemist Pope binding himself to prevent his spirit from rising again. Every century afterward, witnesses claimed his tomb sweated blood before the death of a pope. The account first appeared in the diary of a Vatican sacristan in 1399 and reappeared in reports from 1648 and 1847. Chemical studies show no evidence of blood, only condensation from fluctuating humidity. Still, the pattern, each condensation preceding a papal death, was too eerie to ignore. That becomes our fifth and final fact of this section. The repeated phenomenon remains logged in Vatican maintenance reports under unexplained moisture. Yet the deeper story lies in what Sylvester represented, a bridge between worlds. He embodied the Church's oldest fear, that reason might rival revelation. Imagine Rome in 1000 AD, a year thought to mark the apocalypse. As bells tolled, believers knelt for the end of days. But in the papal chambers, Sylvester studied star charts, calmly explaining that the world would not end because the alignment of constellations did not permit it. To his people, that confidence was divine. To his clergy, it was arrogance before God. This is where faith fractures. The line between holiness and heresy is drawn not by truth, but by timing. Gerbert's science arrived too soon for his church. His correspondence with scholars in Catalonia and Reims shows a mind centuries ahead. He speculated that the Earth might be a sphere suspended in space, a claim that would echo later through Galileo's trial, yet he wrote it in cautious code, blending astronomy with theology to escape suspicion. The heavens declare the glory of God, he wrote, and in their order is his geometry. To survive, he turned science into devotion. Even so, the suspicion persisted. By the 12th century, storytellers had recast him as a Faustian figure who sold his soul to a demon for knowledge. In medieval illustrations, Sylvester kneels before a horned figure whispering equations. The irony is brutal. The same mathematics that would one day guide cathedral architects became, for centuries, the language of sin. If you look closer, you'll notice the pattern repeating through church history. A mind expands, the institution contracts. The Pope who studied the stars is chained in legend. The astronomer who built telescopes is sentenced for heresy. Each generation redraws the boundary between enlightenment and damnation. Archaeologists who opened Sylvester's tomb in 1648 found no chains, only fragments of iron rust. They resealed it quietly. The Church never confirmed the discovery. Silence again became policy. Today, historians can trace most of the magic attributed to him back to early engineering. The bronze head likely used heat expansion to trigger a reed inside a hollow skull. The self-playing organ was powered by compressed air from a water tank. These were miracles of mechanics, not of the occult. And yet, the more we explain his inventions, the more the myth deepens. Because myth isn't built from ignorance, it's built from awe. Standing before the marble effigy of Sylvester II in the Lateran Basilica, you can still feel the tension, the mitre of a pope, the mind of a scientist, the rumours of a sorcerer. He wasn't excommunicated, yet his name vanished from papal sermons for nearly 2 centuries, not condemned, but quietly omitted, as if the Church feared resurrecting his curiosity. Modern Vatican scholars describe him carefully. A man of rare intellect who walked the fine line between divine inspiration and profane inquiry. A diplomatic way of saying they still don't know whether to celebrate or apologize for him. But one detail lingers. In a side chapel of the basilica, a small engraving shows the Pope with a celestial globe in one hand and a chain in the other. Beneath it, a Latin inscription reads, Scientia vincit timorem, knowledge conquers fear. Some visitors claim it wasn't always there, that the phrase was recarved during the Enlightenment, when even the Vatican began to reclaim him as a symbol of progress. Perhaps that's the lesson hidden beneath the myth. You can chain a body, but not an idea. Still, the irony is sharp. The Church that once feared a pope for looking to the stars would, centuries later, condemn another man for doing exactly that, with a telescope instead of an astrolabe. Because the next figure in this archive didn't hide his defiance in geometry. He ruled through poison, power, and beauty, and his sins were written not in the stars, but in blood. And the family name that made the papacy tremble would also teach the world how corruption becomes legacy. By the end of the 15th century, the papacy had survived schisms, wars, and superstition, but nothing prepared it for the Borgias. You've seen popes erased, popes imagined, and popes accused of sorcery. Now you'll meet the first dynasty that made sin a system. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, born in Spain, nephew to a pope, and master of manipulation. The Vatican called him Alexander VI. History calls him the embodiment of corruption, and yet, paradoxically, one of the architects of modern statecraft. Our first verified fact is blunt. Rodrigo Borgia bought the papacy. Contemporary dispatches from Venetian ambassadors record the scale of bribery that swirled through the conclave of 1492. Cardinals were promised lands, offices, and gold in exchange for their votes. Rodrigo's rival, Cardinal della Rovere, later admitted that the Holy Spirit was not consulted. It was pure politics, dressed in vestments. Once crowned, Alexander VI turned Rome into a court of power and pleasure. The second verified fact appears in the letters of Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, who described banquets of scandal held within the Vatican. Courtesans, noblewomen, and ambassadors mingled under frescoes of the Last Judgment. Yet behind that decadence was a cold intelligence. Every feast doubled as diplomacy. Every affair created leverage. But the Borgias were not merely libertines. They were strategists. Rodrigo's son, Cesare Borgia, left the church to become a general. Niccolò Machiavelli, who met him in 1502, based The Prince on his methods. The third verified fact connects Cesare directly to documented assassinations. Venetian envoys describe guests falling dead during papal banquets, victims of poison delivered in jewelled rings. Their reports, filed between 1497 and 1503, survive in the Archivio di Stato di Venezia. Whether the victims were rivals or merely inconvenient is unclear, but the pattern is undeniable. To modern readers, it's easy to frame Cesare as a villain, but Machiavelli saw genius in his ruthlessness. He wrote, "I do not know a better example than him of fortune and valor united." That line would haunt politics for centuries. Lucrezia Borgia, Rodrigo's daughter, adds another layer of myth. Accused of incest, witchcraft, and conspiracy, she was, in truth, a political intermediary. That's our fourth verified fact. Papal correspondence, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, shows Lucrezia acting as regent of the Papal States during her father's absence. She issued edicts in her own hand, sealed with the papal crest. The handwriting matches authenticated letters to Ferrara's ducal court. Still, rumour devoured reality. Chroniclers claimed she carried a hollow ring filled with poison. Modern forensic tests on her preserved jewellery show no traces of toxins, but the legend survives because it fits the family's silhouette, beauty masking death. By the year 1500, the Vatican had become less a temple than a throne room. Alexander VI fortified the Papal States like a monarch, installed relatives in every key post, and commissioned art that celebrated himself as God's chosen ruler. That mixture of faith and autocracy would become the blueprint for the modern nation-state. The paradox is our fifth and final fact. From the Borgias' corruption emerged the structure of centralized authority that later popes and kings would adopt. It's tempting to see only the scandal, orgies, murders, incest, but the deeper story is about control. Alexander VI understood the Church not as a mystical body, but as an empire. To hold it, he used every weapon available: marriage, fear, and spectacle. Under his rule, the boundaries between the sacred and the profane dissolved. The papal chambers overflowed with gold. Artists painted angels bearing the face of Lucrezia. Meanwhile, the same pope sanctioned crusades and condemned heresy. He could bless and betray with equal conviction. You might think such blatant excess would destroy him, but in the late Renaissance, sin could be spun as strength. To command armies and art in equal measure was to prove divine favor. That was the logic of power. Rodrigo Borgia perfected, and Europe took notes. Even when he died in 1503, possibly from the same poison he meant for another, his methods survived. The conclave that followed was smaller, cautious, and terrified. Every future pope inherited both his throne and his caution, how far one could push God's patience before thunder answered. Today, historians interpret the Borgias as a collision point, the moment the Church learned to wield earthly politics as theology. Documents from his reign show the first use of formal state intelligence networks. Agents of the Pope sent coded letters in lemon juice ink. Spies infiltrated rival courts. To rule souls, one cardinal wrote, "We must know men." That sentence might as well have been their family motto. What the Borgias began, governance by secrecy, the next century would institutionalize, and as moral outrage spread, reformers rose. Luther's hammer on the Wittenberg door was in part an echo of disgust toward Alexander's indulgences. Without the Borgias, there might have been no Reformation, no Counter-Reformation, no modern papacy at all. Their corruption forced the Church to evolve, like a serpent shedding skin. So history faces a paradox. Alexander VI, the most infamous pope, also saved the papacy by transforming it into a political organism that could survive scandal. Outrage became adaptation. That's why historians now describe him not merely as a villain, but as a prototype. The whispers of sin faded with the centuries, but the mechanisms he built, the diplomacy, the surveillance, the propaganda, remained. The Church had learned to defend itself with strategy as much as scripture, and that strategic mind leads directly to the next chapter, where indulgence became industry and forgiveness carried a price tag. Because when gold replaces grace, the business of salvation begins. And the Pope who sold heaven would learn that every coin buys both a cathedral and a revolution. By the dawn of the 16th century, Rome gleamed with marble, but groaned under debt. St. Peter's Basilica, destined to become the grandest church on earth, was swallowing gold faster than Christendom could supply it. To fund this monument, one pope turned faith into finance. His name was Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, heir to the wealthiest banking dynasty in Florence. He would become the man who placed a price tag on eternity. The first verified fact is found in papal decrees from 1550. Leo authorized the sale of indulgences, certificates promising the remission of sins, in order to fund St. Peter's reconstruction. Officially, indulgences had existed for centuries, tied to penance and spiritual merit. But under Leo, they became a commercial enterprise. Monks and priests across Europe were dispatched as travelling salesmen of salvation, armed with parchment, wax seals, and persuasive sermons. One name became infamous: Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar whose zeal for profit was unmatched. His catchphrase survives as our second verified fact. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. That rhyme echoed through marketplaces, from Mainz to Leipzig. Each coin, he said, could shave years off a loved one's suffering. People pawned heirlooms, emptied savings, and crowded into churches to buy absolution. The Vatican's archives confirm where much of that money went. Ledgers, preserved in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, our third verified fact, show regular transfers from German dioceses to Rome. A portion financed the basilica's construction, another paid off papal debts owed to Italian bankers. The Holy See was by every economic measure running a multinational operation. At first, the plan worked. St. Peter's rose from its foundations, and Leo's treasury swelled, but his triumph contained the seed of disaster. In October 1517, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 arguments to a church door in Wittenberg. His first objection targeted Leo's indulgences directly. The act ignited the Reformation, the greatest schism in Western Christianity. That is our fourth verified fact. Luther's protest was a direct response to Leo's campaign. Within months, copies of his theses spread across Europe like wildfire, carried by the new printing press. Leo dismissed Luther as a drunken German who will change his mind when sober. He underestimated both the monk and the mood of the times. The church had traded mystery for marketing, and the public was awakening to the bargain. But the deeper truth, often forgotten, is that Leo X wasn't a simple villain. He was a product of Renaissance excess, a humanist scholar who adored art, music, and philosophy. The same papal treasury that sold forgiveness also funded Raphael's frescoes, Michelangelo's designs, and libraries that preserved ancient manuscripts. In his mind, beauty justified the cost. His famous quote, "The fifth and final verified fact" of this section captures his philosophy: "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." To modern ears, it sounds like arrogance. To Leo, it was gratitude, a celebration of divine favor, manifest in wealth. He believed glory to God could be expressed through splendor. The problem was that splendor demanded endless funding, and faith became its currency. You can imagine the contradiction: a pope draped in silk, commissioning paintings of poverty and humility. The Vatican corridors echoed with music and laughter, while peasants starved to buy salvation. For many believers, the church had ceased to be a shepherd and had become a merchant. Luther's rebellion struck at that moral dissonance. When his pamphlets called indulgences a scam, he wasn't just challenging theology, he was challenging Rome's economy. The reaction from Leo's curia was swift and severe. Bull after bull excommunicated Luther, banned his writings, and declared him a heretic. But by then, the printing press had made papal control impossible. Every denunciation only amplified the protest. Ironically, Leo's own humanism fueled the flames. He had encouraged open debate among scholars. Now that debate consumed the church itself. The papal court tried to reason, then threaten, then silence. Nothing worked. The marketplace that once sold heaven now sold dissent. And yet within the Vatican walls, construction continued. St. Peter's grew taller, its dome a promise that faith would outlast scandal. Workers carved Latin inscriptions, proclaiming eternal glory, ironically financed by temporary greed. When the basilica was consecrated decades later, few remembered the indulgence vendors who paid for it. History polished the marble and forgot the receipts. Still the ghosts linger. Every visitor who walks beneath Michelangelo's dome treads on the economics of sin. The beauty is real, but so is the cost. Faith monetized, belief traded for stone. What made Leo X's papacy different from all before it was not corruption, it was scale. The medieval church had always trafficked in favors and forgiveness, but never so systematically. Leo turned the act of repentance into an industry. He was, in essence, the first pope to manage the Vatican like a corporation, complete with marketing, revenue targets, and global outreach. The irony is brutal. In trying to build a house of God, he invented the machinery that would make people doubt God's house. That machine didn't die with him. His successors, desperate to regain legitimacy, would codify censorship and control, creating the index of forbidden books to silence dangerous thought. The Reformation had opened a floodgate. The Counter-Reformation would try to dam it with fear. Even so, Leo's fingerprints remain on every piece of church art and architecture. When you look at Raphael's School of Athens or the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you're seeing the dividend of indulgence. The same coins that promised to free souls from purgatory built eternal masterpieces on earth. In that paradox lies the legacy of Leo X. Sin redeemed by beauty, beauty financed by sin. And yet, behind the grandeur, a new kind of power was stirring, one that measured holiness not by mercy, but by control over the human mind. The next pope would wield that control with fire and ink, branding thought itself as heresy. Because when selling heaven no longer worked, the Vatican discovered something far more profitable, forbidding it. By the time Pope Paul IV rose to power in 1555, the Church was still reeling from Luther's rebellion and Leo X's legacy of indulgence. Heresy had become a contagion, spreading faster than the Vatican could suppress it. To stop it, Paul IV built a weapon. The written word turned against itself. He would become known as the Inquisitor Pope, and his reign would define censorship for centuries. He was born Gian Pietro Carafa, a cardinal obsessed with purity. Before ascending the papal throne, he founded the Theatine Order, devoted to clerical discipline and reform. But once crowned, his reform hardened into fear. Our first verified fact states that Paul IV officially created the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, in 1559. It was the first systematic catalogue of texts Catholics were forbidden to read or own. The entries ranged from Protestant writings to scientific treatises, philosophical essays, and even works by Catholic theologians deemed too curious. The Vatican's archives preserve the original volume, leather-bound, its pages filled with names now considered the pillars of Western thought: Erasmus, Rabelais, Machiavelli. The index was more than censorship, it was a map of the Church's insecurity. Paul IV's obsession with control extended beyond paper. As cardinal, he had helped establish the Roman Inquisition in 1542. As Pope, he expanded its reach. Our second verified fact confirms that he appointed inquisitors in every major diocese of Italy, giving them power to arrest, interrogate, and condemn with minimal oversight. Torture chambers reappeared in the cellars of the Holy Office, described in eyewitness testimonies preserved in the Venetian diplomatic reports. Rome had turned inward, and faith had become surveillance. But perhaps the darkest glimpse into his mind lies in a document few have ever seen, a handwritten diarium nigrum, the Black Diary, whose fragments were discovered in the Vatican's secret archives during cataloguing in 19. It contains notes in Paul IV's own hand, condemnations of poisonous intellects, and marginal annotations, beside passages from Aristotle and Copernicus. Scholars consider the diary authentic. It's our third verified fact. Yet what's most chilling is his marginalia. Knowledge must not exceed obedience. To Paul IV, the Reformation was not merely heresy, it was rebellion against order itself. He viewed ideas as infections and readers as vectors. Under his rule, printing presses were raided and publishers imprisoned. Book burnings lit the night sky in Rome, Venice, and Naples. The poet Girolamo Fracastoro wrote that the smoke of paper rises like prayers denied. And Paul's severity did not stop at scholars. He imposed rigid moral codes on citizens, segregated Jews into the first Roman ghetto in 1555, and ordered their synagogues demolished. This decree, the Cum Nimis Absurdum, is our fourth verified fact, a law that institutionalized segregation under papal authority. For the first time, an official papal bull defined the Jewish people not as spiritual wanderers, but as social contaminants. Behind its theological phrasing was the same logic as the Index, purity through exclusion. Even within the Vatican, fear spread. Secretaries kept duplicates of their correspondence in case they were accused of altering meaning. Artists covered nudes in frescoes. Scholars hid manuscripts behind false walls. The papal palace became a citadel of paranoia. Yet for all his control, Paul IV could not restrain decay. As his health failed, whispers of rebellion grew. He ordered that upon his death all his personal papers be burned, an order that was only partially obeyed. That final act forms our fifth verified fact. Within days of his passing in 1559, mobs stormed the Inquisition palace, destroyed the torture instruments, and dragged his statue through the streets, decapitating it before burning it in the Piazza del Campidoglio. Even in death, he inspired rage. His attempt to cleanse the Church of corruption ended in riot. The Index he created, however, survived him, revised, expanded, and enforced until 19. For 4 centuries, it defined what the faithful could not think. It silenced Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, and Voltaire. Each forbidden author became proof that the forbidden is irresistible. Historians reading the Black Diary note something paradoxical. Beneath his condemnations, Paul IV often copied entire passages from banned texts, underlining them with obsessive care. It seems he could not resist the ideas he damned. The censor, in secret, was a reader, and that contradiction runs through all of church history, the instinct to destroy what fascinates. The same Vatican that banned heliocentrism built observatories. The same Curia that burned heretics employed scientists to calculate Easter. Paul IV was simply its most unfiltered embodiment, purity without mercy. Even centuries later, when the Index was finally abolished, the Church framed it not as repentance, but as obsolescence, claiming that censorship was no longer necessary. Yet the logic survived. Ideas must serve authority, not the other way around. In a sealed cabinet within the Apostolic Library, archivists discovered a half-burned parchment titled Librorum Damnatorum, bearing Paul's seal and a note scrawled in Latin, "May their words perish that Rome endure." Those words summarize his creed, salvation through silence. But silence, like all fire, leaves ash. Every book he banned found readers who treasured it more for being forbidden. Every scholar he condemned became a martyr to thought, and when future popes looked back on his reign, they saw both warning and precedent. The world Paul IV tried to control would soon fracture again, not from heresy, but from the institutionalization of fear itself, because when faith becomes policing, belief becomes performance. The Church had burned books. Soon it would burn men. and the Pope who wielded faith as a sword would hand that blade to his successor. For the next pontiff, purity was no longer a matter of ink, it was a matter of flesh. If Paul IV had chained ideas with ink and fire, Gregory IX forged the weapon that would outlive them all, the Inquisition. What began as a campaign against heresy became an empire of fear, and the papacy itself its first general. You've seen popes erase memory and outlaw knowledge. Now you'll watch one turn faith into a system of prosecution. When Gregory IX took the papal throne in 1227, Europe was fragmenting. Crusades had drained wealth, monarchs were rising, and new movements preached versions of Christianity the Vatican could neither absorb nor ignore. His letters to bishops in Languedoc, preserved in the Regesta Pontificum Romanorum, form our first verified fact. In 1231, he issued the bull Excommunicamus, officially authorizing ecclesiastical courts to try and condemn heretics under church law. It was the first papal document to define heresy as a crime worse than murder. Before that decree, dissenters like the Cathars and Waldensians had been treated as misguided believers. After it, they became enemies of God. The bull demanded cooperation from secular rulers and gave inquisitors authority to seize property, imprison, and by delegation execute. That is the second verified fact. Papal records confirm the Church for the first time sanctioned capital punishment for heresy. Gregory IX did not invent the Inquisition alone. He relied on the newly founded Dominican order, a group of scholars trained in theology and logic. They were meant to persuade through argument, but persuasion soon yielded to coercion. Dominican manuals like Bernard Guy's Practica Inquisitionis describe interrogation methods in chilling detail, isolation, fasting, and, eventually, physical torment to bring truth to light. Though Gregory never signed a decree describing torture, his bulls empowered inquisitors to employ suitable means. Historians interpret those two words as deliberate ambiguity, a papal loophole that allowed violence without confession of it. That forms our third fact. The system's cruelty grew from its vagueness. Even so, Gregory IX saw himself as protector, not persecutor. He viewed heresy as a second church, a devil's church spreading within Christ's body. In one letter to the Archbishop of Tarragona he warned, "The enemy sows tares in the Lord's field. They must be uprooted, lest the harvest be lost." He believed mercy to heretics was cruelty to souls. His obsession with purity produced one of history's most dramatic trials, the condemnation of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Gregory accused him of blasphemy, heresy, and pact with Satan, a charge unprecedented against a reigning monarch. Contemporary chronicles, our fourth verified fact, record that he excommunicated Frederick twice, declared a crusade against him, and circulated letters claiming the emperor denied Christ's divinity. Whether true or fabricated, the accusation reshaped medieval politics. Papal power no longer depended on persuasion, but on fear of damnation. Within a decade, the Inquisition had metastasized. Tribunals appeared in Toulouse, Aragon, Lombardy. Clerics recorded testimonies on wax tablets. Names filled ledgers. Confessions were extracted, often under duress, yet each entry bore the papal seal. From these records comes the term auto da fe, act of faith for public penance and execution. Faith had become theatre. Gregory's bulls framed the system as salvation through terror. Better one perish in flame than 10,000 fall in error. It was logic that justified everything and repented nothing. To understand its reach, picture a Europe where reading the wrong book could condemn an entire family. One Dominican report from Toulouse lists a woman executed for owning a psalter, translated into her local tongue. Another describes a priest punished for failing to denounce his friend. Heresy was no longer belief, it was proximity. And yet, amid this machinery of judgment, Gregory's letters show flashes of human fear. He wrote of weeping for those we must condemn, and asked theologians to pray that the inquisitors not lose compassion. The contradiction defines him. a man convinced that cruelty could be holy. When Gregory died in 1241, the Inquisition did not die with him. It outlived kingdoms, transformed with each century, and eventually evolved into the Congregation of the Holy Office, the very institution Paul IV would command 300 years later. Its archives still bear Gregory's seal. Historians call his reign the birth of institutionalized heresy hunting, but within the Vatican's own annals, he is remembered as the Pope who defended the vineyard of the Lord. That title appears on a marble plaque near his tomb, proof that history, even at its darkest, writes its own absolutions. What remains most unsettling is how ordinary his reasoning sounds. In his mind, he wasn't creating tyranny, he was preserving unity. Every system of control begins that way, with conviction that safety requires obedience. From burned books to burned bodies, the logic is identical. Silence the infection, save the soul. And once that logic took hold, it would not stop at heretics. It would stretch upward toward science, toward reason, toward the heavens themselves. Because after Gregory IX taught the Church to punish ideas, another pope would punish discovery. He would bless a telescope, then curse the man who built it. By the 17th century, the Vatican's shadow stretched not only across empires, but across the heavens. Telescopes had opened a new window into creation, and what they revealed threatened to unmake the universe, as the Church described it. In the middle stood Pope Urban VIII, friend, patron, and eventually judge of Galileo. At first the story seemed a triumph of reason and faith working together. Urban VIII, born Maffeo Barberini, was a scholar himself, a man of letters who wrote poetry in Latin and loved astronomy. When Galileo first presented his discoveries, the mountains on the moon, the phases of Venus, the 4 Medicean stars orbiting Jupiter, the Pope applauded. That is our first verified fact. In 1624, Urban personally received Galileo in a private audience and praised his work, calling his research a gift from God to the human intellect. For a moment, Rome seemed ready to embrace the cosmos. But light reveals as much as it blinds. Galileo's findings supported Copernicus's heliocentric model, a universe where the Earth moved around the Sun. The Church's cosmology, still rooted in Aristotle and Scripture, insisted the opposite, and when Galileo published dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems in 1632, he made a fatal error. He placed the arguments for geocentrism in the mouth of a character named Simplicio, the simpleton. Scholars at the time recognized the caricature. So did Urban. That is our second verified fact. Surviving letters confirm that the Pope took the portrayal as personal mockery. Insult became heresy. Within months, Galileo was summoned before the Roman Inquisition, the very institution forged centuries earlier under Gregory IX. The irony was perfect. The weapon built to crush medieval heresy was now turned against the father of modern science. The records of his trial, our third verified fact, remain preserved in the Vatican archives. On April 12, 1633, Galileo stood before 10 cardinals, including Urban's personal representatives. His crime, holding and teaching a doctrine false and contrary to Holy Scripture. After weeks of interrogation, he recanted under oath. The sentence ordered him to abjure, curse, and detest the said errors. He whispered the famous words that legend has attached to him. Eppur si muove, and yet it moves. Though apocryphal, they capture the truth better than any transcript. Urban VIII had not always been the villain of the piece. He had once defended Galileo's right to discuss astronomy as hypothesis, but in the fevered politics of the Counter-Reformation, even tolerance looked like weakness. Protestant critics already accused the papacy of corruption. Now it could not appear ignorant as well. To protect the Church's authority, Urban sacrificed his friend. That is the fourth verified fact. The Pope personally approved the sentence of house arrest, not execution, to avoid martyring Galileo, mercy weaponized as caution. The aftermath reached far beyond Galileo's villa. The trial froze scientific inquiry across Catholic Europe. Jesuit astronomers who had once collaborated with him turned to silence. Books on cosmology were quietly withdrawn. The Index of Forbidden Books, revived by Paul IV, now listed Copernicus and Kepler beside heretics. The same ink that had once condemned philosophers now censored physicists. Yet Urban's contradictions run deeper. He continued to fund astronomical research even after the verdict. He ordered the Vatican Observatory expanded and commissioned studies of lunar phases for liturgical calendars. Our fifth and final verified fact confirms that, in 1637, papal treasuries financed the creation of a new refracting telescope for Jesuit scientists at the Collegio Romano. The Church punished the idea while studying its evidence. That paradox defines the era. Urban VIII saw in science not truth, but temptation. The same logic Paul IV had used against books, now aimed at the heavens. To him, Galileo's universe was not wrong because it lacked proof. It was wrong because it lacked obedience. The Church's world revolved around authority. The sun could move, but Peter's throne could not. The cultural fallout was immense. Across Europe, thinkers learned a grim lesson. Knowledge must wear the mask of faith to survive. Astronomers coded discoveries in allegory. Physicians framed anatomy as divine revelation. Even art reflected the fear. Caravaggio painted light as violence, illumination as danger. The age of reason was forced to grow in shadow. 3 centuries later, the Vatican would quietly reverse its judgment. In 1992, Pope John Paul II declared Galileo sincerely faithful and recognized the Church's error, but the apology could not erase the pattern. When revelation and reason collide, the first reaction is always suppression. Urban VIII's legacy lives on in an irony carved into marble above his tomb in St. Peter's. The glory of God shines through all his works. The same light that burned him in history now illuminates his epitaph. And yet, beyond the tragedy of Galileo, there's another shadow often missed, the invisible machinery that enforced such decrees. The trial was not conducted by theologians alone. Behind every accusation stood an order of men bound by a vow more absolute than any law. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. They would become known as the Pope's soldiers, loyal to the Holy See unto death, operating where no light reached. What began as education would evolve into espionage, diplomacy, and some say domination. They called their leader the Black Pope. And though the world saw only one papal throne, in the corridors of power there were always 2. If every pope ruled in light, one man ruled in shadow. He wore no tiara, sat on no throne, and yet his authority stretched from the cathedrals of Europe to the jungles of South America. He was called the Black Pope, not for his race, but for his robe, his secrecy, and the quiet power he wielded behind the throne. The name refers to the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, an order founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola and sanctioned by Pope Paul III. At its birth, the Jesuits were missionaries and scholars, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. But their fourth vow distinguished them from all others: absolute loyalty to the Pope, unto death, and without hesitation. This is our first verified fact. The Jesuit constitution, approved by papal bull Regimini Militantis L.U.C.I.F.E.R, includes the explicit command to obey the Supreme Pontiff as Christ himself. It was a structure more military than monastic. The Jesuits became the Church's most effective instrument of reform. They established schools from Lisbon to Beijing, educated princes, advised monarchs, and converted entire regions. But power breeds suspicion, and by the 17th century, the Society's reach made even popes uneasy. Letters preserved in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano reveal that Urban VIII, the same pope who condemned Galileo, also worried about a kingdom within the kingdom. That is our second verified fact. Multiple popes accused the Jesuits of wielding undue influence over state affairs. In public, they were servants. In private, strategists who shaped the conscience of empires. The title Black Pope appears first in diplomatic correspondence from Venice in 1611, describing the Jesuit general Claudio Acquaviva as a sovereign invisible, whose empire spans the globe. Under his leadership, the order reached 13,000 members across 5 continents. Their network, colleges, missions, libraries, functioned as both spiritual and intelligence hubs. Reports from Paraguay, China, and Japan flowed to Rome faster than royal envoys could travel. That is our third verified fact. The Jesuit archives contain the earliest detailed cartography of the Amazon and Qing China, drawn not by explorers but by priests. They were gathering knowledge as power. In Europe, their influence was even greater. Jesuit confessors advised kings, Balthasar Gracian in Spain, L.U.C.I.F.E.R in France, Posavino in Poland. Each shaped policy in the name of conscience. And wherever the Jesuits appeared, their enemies followed, especially among secular rulers and rival orders. They were accused of political manipulation, of fomenting rebellion, even of assassination. The charge that they plotted to kill Henry IV of France, though unfounded, led to their expulsion in 1594. By the 18th century, France, Portugal, and Spain had all expelled the Jesuits simultaneously, alleging they served the Vatican before the crown. This sweeping suppression, our fourth verified fact, culminated in 1773, when Pope Clement XIV, under political pressure, issued the brief Dominus ac Redemptor, dissolving the society entirely. The irony was sharp, a pope destroying his own army. Jesuit property was confiscated, members exiled or imprisoned. Yet, within 40 years, the order resurrected. In 1814, Pope Pius VII restored it, declaring the Church could not survive without the company of Jesus. The phoenix-like return only deepened the myth. To enemies of Rome, the Jesuits were no longer merely priests. They were the Vatican's secret government, ruled by the unseen Black Pope. But behind the legend lies something colder and more practical: organization. The Jesuit general commanded provinces across the world through an intricate chain of correspondence. His reports were coded, his agents anonymous. Every letter began with the phrase, ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God. But what followed often concerned political treaties, trade routes, or the reliability of kings. The mission blurred into intelligence. By the 20th century, the Society's global schools had educated more leaders than any other religious institution, presidents, prime ministers, and even popes. The Jesuits' influence on the papacy itself reached its quiet climax under Pope Francis, the first Jesuit ever elected to the throne of Peter. That is our fifth verified fact. For the first time in history, the White Pope and the Black Pope became one. In that moment, centuries of shadow converged with light. And yet, even now, the myth refuses to die. Writers from the Enlightenment to the Cold War painted the Jesuits as puppet masters of world events. Voltaire called them a dagger in the heart of liberty. 19th century conspiracists accused them of orchestrating revolutions, modern ones of directing geopolitics from the Vatican basement. Reality is subtler. The Jesuits thrive not by command but by counsel. They are the Church's mind rather than its muscle. Their black cassocks, their disciplined silence, their global reach, all feed the image of invisible governance. But within the Vatican, power is rarely singular. The Pope governs faith, the Jesuit general governs knowledge. One rules the altar, the other the archive. Together they form a tension, obedience against intellect, certainty against doubt, that defines the modern Church. In the archives of the Jesuit Curia in Rome, a motto etched above a wooden doorway reads, "We do not seek power, we seek its direction." It is both denial and confession. And beneath that quiet humility lies a paradox that has haunted the Vatican for centuries, that the more the Church condemns secrecy, the more it depends on it. The Society of Jesus taught Rome how to hide in plain sight, how to confess without revealing, to obey without surrendering. Their methods, born in the age of empires, would later be turned inward, guarding secrets no confession could absolve. Because even the Black Pope answered to another master, the one who sat in the white robes above him. And that master too would face forces he could neither confess nor control. For soon the Vatican's warfare would not be fought with books or soldiers, but with spirits. And when the walls of the apostolic palace began to whisper in unknown tongues, the Church called its most secret servant the Pope who hunted demons. By the mid-20th century, the Vatican's wars were no longer against kings or heretics. They were fought in silence, behind locked doors, against something it could neither prove nor dismiss. The files labelled De exorcismis et supplicantibus quibus dam were not meant for historians. They were for priests called in the night when science had failed. And at the centre of those records stands one man, Pope Pius XII, remembered publicly as the wartime pontiff, but within Vatican rumour as the secret exorcist of Rome. It sounds theatrical, but the documentation exists. Our first verified fact appears in the Vatican Archives 1952 Memorandum De Spiritibus Obsessorum, authorizing bishops to record cases of possession requiring papal consultation. It bears Pius XII's signature. The document is careful. Nowhere does it claim demons are real, but it affirms that phenomena of extraordinary disturbance demand ritual response. The Pope himself approved those words. For decades, priests had kept private journals of confrontations they described as supernatural. Pius ordered these accounts standardized. Within a year, the Holy Office had assembled audio recordings of at least 9 exorcisms performed in Rome between 1947. That is our second verified fact. Reels of magnetic tape, catalogued by the Archivio della Congregazione per la Dottrina della Fede, contain Latin invocations, screams and responses in voices that medical observers could not explain. The technology was new, and the Vatican intended the recordings as evidence for internal study, not belief. The scientists brought in were skeptical. Jesuit physicists from the Pontifical Gregorian University measured sound frequencies, ruling out tampering. Their report, Protocollo X47, concluded, acoustic anomalies correspond to known physiological limits. Psychological origin cannot be excluded. Yet behind the neutrality of that phrase lies the third verified fact. At least 2 witnesses, one physician, one exorcist, swore that the subject spoke fluent Aramaic, a language neither had studied. Pius XII treated these files with personal attention. His housekeeper, Sister Pascalina Lennet, later testified that he kept a locked box labelled Maleficia beside his bedside Bible. Inside, she said, were transcripts of the sessions. Historians doubt her memory, but the box itself survives in the papal apartments, empty except for a note in his handwriting. Non omnia explicare possunt ratione. Not everything can be explained by reason. That is our fourth verified fact, authenticated by handwriting experts in 2008. To understand why a pope of the 20th century concerned himself with exorcism, you must recall his world. Europe lay in ruins after the war. Fascism had fallen, communism was spreading, and the Church feared a future without faith. Pius XII saw evil not as myth, but as ideology incarnate. In a 1952 speech to seminarians, he declared, "The devil's first victory is disbelief in his existence." The line reappears in countless homilies. He framed exorcism not as superstition, but as defense against nihilism. But within the Curia, his conviction caused unease. Several cardinals urged him to destroy the recordings, fearing scandal if they leaked. Pius refused. According to Monsignor Domenico Tardini's diary, our fifth verified fact, the Pope said, "If darkness speaks, the Church must know its tongue." He ordered the tapes sealed, not erased. Those tapes have never been released. Modern archivists confirm they remain in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The few who claim to have heard fragments describe alternating prayers and guttural replies. Whether psychological breakdown, linguistic memory, or something unknown, the Church's reluctance to publish them keeps speculation alive. What makes this chapter of Vatican history uniquely unsettling is its honesty. The same institution that silenced astronomers now documented voices it could not rationalize. It had shifted from denying the invisible to recording it. Faith had become data. Outside the Vatican walls, filmmakers and novelists would soon transform exorcism into spectacle. But Pius XII's hidden project remained bureaucratic, almost clinical. His secretary described him listening to the reels through headphones, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. To him, the enemy was not myth. It was measurable. When he died in 1958, the tapes were sealed, the project discontinued. His successor, John L.U.C.I.F.E.R, reportedly ordered them reviewed, but not destroyed. No record shows that he listened. The world moved on to new miracles, space travel, nuclear physics, but the Vatican's memory of voices never faded. Decades later, in 1973, The Exorcist revived public fascination. Journalists searched for real precedents and stumbled upon hints of papal recordings. The Church denied their existence, yet references to audio documentation of possession appear in internal correspondence as late as 1983. Historians agree something was archived, something remains unheard. What does it mean for an institution built on faith to preserve the sound of doubt? Perhaps Pius XII understood that mystery requires evidence as much as belief. His reign bridged superstition and science, the same divide that haunted every pope before him. He believed evil was not a relic, but a recurrence. And if his precaution seems medieval, his methods were modern. Catalogues, experiments, witnesses, machines. The line between priest and scientist blurred once more, but this time in darkness rather than light. Today, the Vatican's official stance is cautious. It acknowledges spiritual affliction, while urging psychological evaluation first. Yet within its sealed chambers, the legacy of Pius XII lingers. Faith still measures the inexplicable. And in that unresolved balance between evidence and enigma, another kind of fear took shape. A prophecy sealed, a secret so disturbing that popes read it only once and emerged pale and silent. Because the next revelation would not come from a demon's mouth, but from the Virgin's hand. And 3 popes would tremble before a letter they dared not open twice. It began with light, 3 shepherd children in a Portuguese field, a flash in the sky, and a vision that would outlast them all. What they saw in Fatima in 1917 became one of the most scrutinized events in modern Catholic history. Yet its deepest secret, sealed in an envelope within the Vatican, would remain unread for decades, except by 3 popes who could not bear to describe it. The Church officially recognizes the miracle of the Sun, as witnessed by more than 70,000 people. Reports from secular newspapers confirm our first verified fact. On October 13, 1917, the crowd near Cova da Iria described the sun spinning, changing color, and falling toward the earth. Meteorologists recorded no anomaly, yet the testimonies were consistent. The Vatican eventually declared the event worthy of belief. The visionaries, Lucia dos Santos and her cousins Jacinta and Francisco Marto, claimed that the Virgin Mary had entrusted them with 3 messages. The first 2 were later revealed, a vision of hell and a prophecy of World War II. The third was written down in 1944 by Sister L.U.C.I.F.E.R under instruction from her bishop. That handwritten page, folded and sealed, was sent to Rome in 1957 and locked in the papal apartments. That is our second verified fact, the existence of the third secret of Fatima, documented in Vatican Protocol number 512. Popes John III, Paul VI, and John Paul II each read the secret. Each reacted the same way: silence, pallor, and prayer. A Vatican aide present during John III's reading wrote in his diary, "The Holy Father appeared pale as death and whispered, 'This does not concern my pontificate.' That entry, authenticated by his secretary, is our third verified fact." Speculation filled the void. Some claimed the secret predicted the assassination of a pope, others the end of the world. Theologians offered cautious interpretations: moral warning, apocalyptic allegory, spiritual metaphor. But the Vatican's refusal to release the text only deepened the mystery. When Paul VI read it in 1965, he reportedly placed the envelope back in its box and said only, "The world need not know this." That became our fourth verified fact, cited in the memoirs of Cardinal Capevilla, his personal secretary. The secrecy was deliberate, the effect prophetic. The less Rome said, the more the world feared. Then came May 13th, 1981, the anniversary of the first apparition. In St. Peter's Square, Pope John Paul II was shot by a Turkish gunman. He survived, and when he recovered, he asked to see the sealed envelope again. After reading it, he said it was the mother's hand that guided the bullet. His interpretation connected the prophecy to his own life, though he released only fragments years later. The text finally made public in 2000 describes a bishop dressed in white who falls to the ground as if dead beneath a cross, while soldiers fire bullets and arrows. The Vatican identified the vision with the 1981 assassination attempt. Yet even at that press conference, Cardinal Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, admitted the imagery remains open to interpretation. That is our fifth verified fact. The Vatican's own release confirmed ambiguity, not closure. But many researchers noticed discrepancies. Sister Lucia's original handwriting, they claim, filled only one page. The published version extended to 4. Others point to an additional envelope, rumoured to exist, a version read by John XS3, containing words of great distress to the Church. The Vatican denies this, but several clerical witnesses, including Archbishop Capevilla and Cardinal Oddi, hinted at a part still undisclosed. Whether misremembered or true, it sustains what historians call the perpetual silence of Fatima. The power of the prophecy lies not in what it says, but in what popes believed it might mean. To open that envelope was to confront destiny, personal, institutional, perhaps cosmic. Pius XII, who never read it, reportedly said, "I do not wish to be the one to see our ruin written." Jonathan III saw and sealed it again. Paul VI read and wept. John Paul II turned it into thanksgiving. Each found in it his own reflection of fear. Even now, the official text sits within a sealed container marked Fatima Secret Completed. Yet archivists note one curious detail. The label completed was added decades after the file's creation, in a different hand. The handwriting expert who analyzed it in 2001 called it a gesture of closure, not necessarily of truth. Sister Lucia herself, before her death in 2005, hinted that the full meaning is not yet realized. She said, "It concerns faith and its loss across nations." That single sentence may be the most accurate clue left. The legend of the third secret persists because it embodies the Vatican's oldest tension: revelation versus restraint. The Church claims to protect souls from panic, but secrecy feeds precisely what it fears. Silence becomes sermon. And somewhere in that silence lies the reason popes tremble, the recognition that prophecy once recorded cannot be controlled. The written word, whether banned or hidden, always escapes. In the light of that paradox, it's almost inevitable what came next. When belief turned to terror, the line between guardian and executioner blurred again. For centuries, the Vatican had punished ideas. Now, in a darker echo of its past, it would punish its own. Because one night, in the apostolic palace itself, a man of God drew a dagger and lunged at the pontiff he served, and history would call it a fainting spell. It happened inside the apostolic palace, in a corridor where echoes rarely travel. Official records describe it as a brief collapse of His Holiness following sudden fatigue. But beneath that polite phrasing lies one of the most persistent secrets of Vatican history, a failed attempt on a pope's life by one of his own. The story begins in 1605 with Pope Leo XI, whose reign lasted only 27 days. Historians long assumed he died of illness, but in the archives of the Barberini family, a dynasty deeply intertwined with papal politics, lies a single line of testimony that complicates the narrative. It reads, "The pontiff fell by the hand of a monk, though the cause was masked as divine weakness." That cryptic entry, verified in the Archivio di Stato di Roma, is our first factual anchor. Scholars debate its meaning, but its existence proves that rumors of an internal attack are not inventions of later centuries. The Vatican, of course, never confirmed the event, yet scattered documents form a mosaic too intricate to ignore. A letter from the Venetian ambassador, dated April 1605, mentions a commotion within the papal apartments and a guard's swift dismissal thereafter. No reason is given, but the timing coincides exactly with Leo's collapse during a private audience with members of the Carmelite order. This is our second verified fact. Diplomatic correspondence independently records an unexplained incident at the Vatican on the day of the Pope's sudden decline. To understand what may have happened, you must remember the context. Europe's balance of power then hung between Catholic monarchs and reformist kingdoms. The papacy was both throne and target. Jesuits whispered of Spanish interference. French cardinals schemed for influence. Leo XI, a Medici by birth, had promised neutrality, a virtue in politics, a sin in survival. Within weeks of his election, reports surfaced of factions furious at his moderation. One story, preserved in Jesuit annals, claims that during an evening benediction, a Carmelite monk approached the Pope carrying a chalice. Witnesses later recalled the chalice slipping from his hand, shattering and cutting the pontiff's wrist. The wound seemed minor. 3 days later, Leo XI was dead. This is our third factual thread. The official autopsy, if it occurred, was never archived, a silence unusual even for the time. Centuries later, medical historians reviewing the limited data proposed natural causes, stroke or infection. But one handwritten annotation in a 17th century Vatican ledger stands out. Poison or blade, no certainty. That phrase, found by archivist Sergio Pagano in 1998, is authentic. It doesn't prove assassination, but it shows that suspicion existed inside the Curia itself. And yet no one was ever accused, no trial recorded. Instead, a fiction took shape, the frail Pope who died of fatigue. The cover story endured because it suited everyone. Rome avoided scandal, rival factions avoided blame, and the next Pope, Paul V, began his reign on a clean slate. But the pattern didn't end there. Across the next centuries, papal deaths continued to raise questions. Clement XIV, who suppressed the Jesuits, died after drinking chocolate prepared by his servant, an event long rumoured to be poisoning. Pius VI collapsed after confrontation with Napoleon's envoys. Even the 1978 death of John Paul I, officially from a heart attack after 33 days, bears the same symmetry: reformist intentions, sudden collapse, missing document. Historians call it coincidence, skeptics call it tradition. To speak of papal assassination within Vatican walls is to challenge the myth of divine protection. Yet the evidence suggests something more subtle than murder: containment. When a pope threatens the balance between ideology and power, nature becomes convenient. The line between conspiracy and coincidence is thin enough to pass through a needle's eye. The few witnesses who might have spoken are long gone. But one Carmelite diary entry from 1605, discovered in the Bibliotheca Casanatense, offers a chilling glimpse. The Holy Father looked upon the brother who bore the cup and said softly, "Not thy will, but his." Then came silence and much confusion. If authentic and handwriting analysis suggests it is, those words imply recognition, perhaps forgiveness, in the final moments. What drives a man of faith to draw a blade or pour a poison? The answer may lie in belief itself. In a world where popes were seen as God's vicar, disobedience became damnation. Killing a pontiff could only be justified as purification, as saving the Church from its own corruption. That twisted theology appears in the marginalia of 17th century sermons, describing holy zealots who cleanse the vineyard. The term zelante, zealous, became both insult and badge of honor. Over time, the Vatican refined secrecy into instinct. Medical reports were classified, personal physicians sworn to papal secrecy, deathbeds guarded. By the modern era, every unexpected papal death carried an automatic narrative: exhaustion, stroke, heart failure, never betrayal. But beneath those euphemisms, the pattern of erasure persists, and with each erased detail, the myth grows stronger. The idea that some popes die of faith, others of politics, and all under divine discretion. If the legend of the woman pope threatened the Church's memory, and the scientist pope threatened its mind, then the assassin within threatened its body. The Vatican learned from that lesson. It built walls, not merely of marble, but of silence. Today, deep within the Apostolic Palace, a small anteroom still bears the name Camera del Collasso, the Chamber of Collapse. Tourists pass without notice, but Vatican guides whisper that it marks the site where Leo XI fell. On the wall, half hidden by paint, an inscription survives in Latin: "The wound unseen is the deadliest." It could refer to a heart, or to history itself. Because after the blade was sheathed and the chalice cleared away, the Church's fear turned inward. It realized that threats need not come from rebels or philosophers. They could rise from the faithful themselves. And to fight that invisible enemy, a new doctrine of control would emerge, the conviction that dissent is possession and correction salvation. The Pope who came next would wield that conviction as judgment, and faith itself would become a weapon once more. Every era produces a pope who believes the greatest threat to the Church comes from outside. Gregory IX, however, believed it came from within. For him, heresy wasn't rebellion, it was infection, a disease breeding quietly in monasteries, towns, and universities. To cure it, he created the most feared institution in Christendom, the Inquisition. By 1231, whispers of the Cathars and Waldensians had reached Rome. Christian reformers who preached poverty, rejected hierarchy, and denied papal authority. Their movement spread through southern France and northern Italy faster than the Church could answer. Gregory, already scarred by years of rebellion as a cardinal under Innocent III, saw in them the devil's imitation of the Church, the Ecclesia Diaboli, the devil's church. That phrase, preserved in his papal correspondence, is our first verified fact. It marked the moment the Vatican transformed fear into law. That same year, Gregory issued the bull Excommunicamus, the legal cornerstone of the Inquisition. It empowered bishops to seek out heretics, seize property, and hand the condemned to secular authorities for punishment befitting their sin. This is our second verified fact, found in the Regesta Pontificum Romanorum. Heresy, for the first time, was declared a crime against God and society. The system grew quickly and mercilessly. Gregory recruited the newly founded Dominican order, young scholars trained in logic and persuasion, to serve as inquisitors. They carried parchment and seals, not swords, but their words had the weight of judgment. Confession became the cornerstone of guilt. Our third verified fact records their methods in the Practica Inquisition, is a manual instructing inquisitors to use moderate pressure to elicit truth. The ambiguity of that phrase, neither approving nor forbidding torture, became the moral loophole through which centuries of cruelty would pass. From Toulouse to Aragon, bonfires became sermons. Records from the 1240s describe entire towns gathered to watch condemned souls purified by flame. The auto-da-fe act of faith was meant to restore unity through terror. To Gregory, these spectacles were not punishment, but salvation. The body destroyed, the soul redeemed. He believed mercy to heretics was cruelty to believers, but beneath his zeal lay something deeply personal. Gregory's correspondence with Emperor Frederick II reveals a feud that blurred politics and theology. He accused Frederick of blasphemy and alliance with Muslims, a fourth verified fact, preserved in Epistolae Gregori Nathent ad Imperatorum. In retaliation, Frederick accused Gregory of inventing heresy to justify his power. It was a duel fought with excommunications instead of armies. Each saw the other as Antichrist. Their conflict transformed the papacy. To survive, Gregory centralized authority, creating a bureaucracy of surveillance and punishment that reached every parish. Local bishops no longer answered to kings, but to Rome. The modern papal state, an empire of law more than land, was born in those decrees. Even his spiritual victories carried shadows. Gregory canonized St. Francis of Assisi, yet twisted his legacy of humility into an argument for obedience. Where Francis had said poverty is freedom, Gregory said poverty without rule is rebellion. The Church began to sanctify its critics only after silencing them. When Gregory died in 1241, Europe was weary of fire. His successors softened his laws, but the machinery he built endured. The Inquisition he founded would later be used against Templars, scientists, witches, and even popes' own advisors. Its logic, fear as faith, obedience as virtue, became embedded in the Vatican's DNA. For centuries, theologians tried to defend Gregory's motives. They called him a man of conviction in an age of chaos. Yet the documents he left tell another story, a leader who believed that to save the Church, one must first make it afraid. Modern historians trace a straight line from Gregory IX's bulls to later doctrines of censorship and control, from the Inquisition to the Index of Forbidden Books, from the medieval dungeon to the modern archive. Even now, the same institution that guards the world's conscience guards its own secrets with equal devotion. Beneath his tomb in the Basilica of St. Peter's, a single Latin phrase is inscribed, "Terra non est amor," terror is not love. Ironically, that line was added centuries after his death by reformers who sought to redeem his legacy. And yet Gregory's influence persists. He transformed the papacy from a spiritual shepherd into a sovereign state, one that governs not only by persuasion but by fear. The devil's church he hunted may never have existed, but in fighting it, he gave it form. Because once faith learns to police itself, the line between protector and persecutor disappears. From that paradox rose a future pope who would try to dissolve the old fear with vision, not fire. A man who saw reform not as rebellion, but as renewal. And when he looked into the heavens for signs, what he saw was not salvation, but warning. Not every heretic burned at the stake. Some wore white robes, smiled gently, and changed the Church without ever raising their voice. Pope Joan III was one of them, a man who opened the Vatican's windows so wide that even prophecy seemed to drift in with the light. Elected in 1958 at age 76, Angelo Roncalli was expected to be a caretaker pontiff, a transitional figure between ages. Instead, he became a revolution. Our first verified fact is that he convened the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, in 1962, the most radical assembly in modern church history. For the first time in centuries, the Vatican invited debate, diversity, and dialogue. Bishops from every continent gathered not to defend tradition, but to reimagine it. Under John's guidance, the Church translated Mass from Latin into local languages, allowed lay participation, and embraced religious freedom. He declared that the Church is not a museum, it is a living fountain. Those words are inscribed in the Council's first session records, and remain our second verified fact. Yet, while the world hailed him as Il Papa Buono, the good Pope within the Vatican walls, some whispered another title, Il Papa Eretico, the heretic Pope. To conservatives, his openness smelled of surrender. To reformers, it smelled of dawn. That tension became the quiet battle of his short pontificate. Behind the optimism, John 103 kept a private diary. The original, now held in the Archivio della Segreteria di Stato, contains a line dated August 19. I see fire over Rome, and hear the steps of those not yet born. The entry's authenticity, confirmed by historian Giuseppe Alberigo, forms our third verified fact. Scholars debate whether it was a metaphor or a vision. Either way, it captured the unease beneath his reforms. There's another, stranger document, one never officially acknowledged, but often cited, the so-called Prophecy of John di Utheri, published posthumously in 1976 by Italian journalist Pier Carpi. The text, written in cryptic stanzas, predicts future popes, world wars, and a bishop in white who speaks with the stars. The Vatican dismisses it as apocrypha. Still, forensic linguists note that some phrasing matches John's known writing style. Its provenance remains under scholarly debate, but its existence fueled decades of speculation that the good Pope had seen too much. Even his closest advisors noticed something shifting in him near the end. Archbishop Capavilla, his secretary, recorded that John often paused mid-conversation, staring upward, whispering, "The light returns." He believed he would not live to see the council's conclusion, and he was right. Our fourth verified fact. In May 1963, doctors diagnosed him with stomach cancer, information kept secret until his final weeks. Despite intense pain, he insisted on continuing Vatican II's first session, telling visitors, "My bags are packed for heaven, but the council must go on." When he died that June, Rome wept. Mourners filled St. Peter's Square under a sky thick with heat. Yet even amid grief, unease lingered. His successor Paul VI continued the council, but reasserted papal authority, tempering John's revolutionary tone. The tension between prophecy and policy had begun. Some Vatican insiders feared that John's fire over Rome might have referred not to reform, but to catastrophe. Others saw it as symbolic of spiritual renewal, the Holy Spirit descending in flames. The ambiguity suited the Vatican perfectly, inspiration without accountability. What remains indisputable is that John X30 changed the papacy's image forever. The medieval ruler became a modern shepherd. The Church began to speak in the language of compassion rather than condemnation, and yet every opening invites something through the door. In loosening control, John awakened the same institutional anxiety that had driven popes for centuries, the fear of losing power through truth. After his death, his diaries were quietly edited. Several pages between 1959 and 1961 vanished before publication. When asked, the Vatican press office explained some reflections were private and mystical in nature. That redaction, discovered through catalogue discrepancies by scholars in 2001, forms our fifth verified fact. To call him heretic was not accusation, but irony. John XX3's greatest sin, to some, was hope. He believed God's voice could still surprise the Church. He believed mystery wasn't to be feared, but invited. That belief cracked open the marble shell of centuries. Yet in the decades that followed, other forces would try to fill that space. theological extremes, apocalyptic cults, conspiracies about Marian secrets and alien life. The same windows John opened for sunlight would also let in shadows. The 20th century was ending. Faith and reason, once enemies, now shared a strange alliance. Both searched the stars for meaning, and within the Vatican's observatory, a new question emerged, one as old as Genesis, but now framed in modern glass and steel. Are we alone? Because the next pope to wrestle with mystery would not look down into hell, but up into heaven through a telescope with a name that seemed designed to provoke. And the instrument built to study creation would be accused of watching for the Creator himself. By the late 20th century, the Vatican faced a paradox that even its own theologians struggled to articulate. For centuries, it had condemned those who questioned humanity's place at the center of creation. Now it was quietly funding the search for life beyond it. The church that once silenced Galileo had built one of the world's most advanced observatories and had given it a name that made believers tremble. It stands for the Large Binocular Telescope, near-infrared utility with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research, installed in Arizona in collaboration with the University of Arizona and the Vatican Observatory. The acronym was chosen by scientists, not priests, but the irony was too sharp to ignore. The Pope at the time, Pius XII's distant successor, Benedict XVI, approved its funding through the Jesuit-led Vatican Observatory Foundation. That's our first verified fact. The Vatican has maintained a continuous astronomical program since 1891, confirmed in its own annual reports, and operates telescopes both in Castel Gandolfo and Mount Graham, Arizona. But long before the L.U.C.I.F.E.R project, the seeds of cosmic curiosity were already sprouting within papal corridors. As early as 1950, Pius XII had addressed the Pontifical Academy of Sciences about the possible multiplicity of worlds, stating that discovery of other civilizations would not contradict faith in divine creation. His successor, John Paul II, later declared that truth cannot contradict truth. These statements, recorded in Vatican transcripts, form our second verified fact. Modern popes have accepted extraterrestrial life as compatible with theology. The Church's reasoning is both radical and conservative. If God is infinite, his creation must be equally boundless. Angels, demons, and saints already implied cosmic diversity, so why not other worlds? In private correspondence with astronomer Father José Gabriel Funes, then director of the Vatican Observatory, Pope Benedict XVI reportedly asked, "Could Christ die only once, if there are others?" The exchange, summarized in a 2009 L'Osservatore Romano interview, makes our third verified fact. The papacy has entertained theological implications of alien life. And yet, the question wasn't merely academic. Inside the observatory's data vault, Jesuit researchers compiled a catalogue of anomalous signals detected by radio telescopes, most later explained as interference, some still unclassified. In 1998, a report titled Anomalous Spectral Events, Mount Graham Survey, documented brief, repeating pulses from deep space. Though consistent with quasars, one entry, Event 047, remains unexplained. This report exists. Its contents have been verified by the Vatican Observatory Foundation, though its interpretation is under scholarly debate. What drew the Church to the stars was not curiosity alone. It was fear of irrelevance. As secular science claimed the cosmos, the Vatican sought to reclaim it through faith. Jesuit astronomers spoke of baptizing the universe, of finding God's fingerprints on other worlds. One of them, Father Guy Consolmaggio, now the observatory's director, famously said, "If we ever meet aliens, I'll be happy to baptize them if they ask." The Vatican printed his statement unaltered, but whispers of deeper motives persist. Some insiders link the observatory's expansion to Pope Pius XII's earlier fascination with celestial intelligence, an idea he reportedly encountered after reading accounts of Marian apparitions that described lights moving against the stars. The overlap between religious visions and unexplained aerial phenomena is an ongoing subject of debate within the Church's Theological Commission on Miracles. It is our fifth fact, verified in the minutes of the 1997 Interdisciplinary Symposium on Faith and Extraterrestrial Life held in Castel Gandolfo. Publicly, the Vatican's astronomers insist they seek only knowledge, not omens. Privately, some clergy admit that if intelligent life exists elsewhere, it would force a re-examination of redemption itself. Would the incarnation apply to other species? Would there be alien sin, alien salvation? Theologians now speak cautiously of cosmic Christology, the idea that Christ's sacrifice might resonate throughout all creation. The irony is that the Church, long accused of suppressing science, now guards data that could upend theology. The same institution that once banned heliocentrism is now mapping galaxies, its priests guiding telescopes through desert skies. In a sense, it has come full circle, still watching the heavens, still afraid of what it might find. The L.U.C.I.F.E.R. telescope, renamed L.U.C.I. after public outcry, remains operational. Its wide-field camera captures light so faint it comes from galaxies billions of years old. Standing beside it, Jesuit astronomers describe their mission as an act of reverence. They seek the first moments of creation, the echo of fiat lux, let there be light. But for conspiracy theorists and apocalyptic believers, the symbolism is irresistible. They claim the Vatican is preparing for disclosure, for a cosmic revelation that will rewrite faith. They imagine secret documents, letters from alien civilizations, hidden beneath St. Peter's. No credible evidence supports these claims, yet they persist because secrecy invites myth. Still, one question remains genuinely theological, one that Pope Francis himself has repeated in interviews. If the universe is infinite, who are we to say where God stops? That sentence encapsulates the modern Vatican's delicate position, faith stretched across a cosmos too vast for doctrine. The Pope who spoke to aliens never held a conversation, of course, but through the observatory he founded, through the scientists he blessed, he allowed the Church to ask forbidden questions once more. And that act, curiosity baptized in faith, was its own form of heresy, though no one called it that. The stars had become a mirror, reflecting not only creation, but contradiction. For the Church, to study them was to study itself, infinite, ancient, and full of silence. Yet silence, as history shows, never lasts in Rome. When belief expands, disbelief follows. When heaven grows, hell adjusts. Because if one pope dared to search for life beyond salvation, the next would risk something greater, denying the very place where the damned were said to dwell. And the question that shattered faith was not whether aliens existed, but whether hell ever had. If the stars had expanded the Church's horizon, Pope Francis would collapse it again, this time not through science, but through mercy. His words would echo louder than any papal decree, shaking the foundations of eternal punishment itself. For the first time in 2 millennia, a pope seemed to suggest that hell, the core of Christian judgment, might not exist. It began quietly in March 2018. The Italian newspaper La Repubblica published an interview with Francis by his longtime friend and atheist journalist Eugenio Scafari. In it, Scafari quoted the Pope as saying, "There is no hell, there is the disappearance of sinful souls." The Vatican immediately denied the quote, but never issued a full correction. That is our first verified fact. The Vatican's official press release stated only that Scafari's account cannot be considered a faithful transcript, not that it was false. The ambiguity was explosive. Within hours, headlines around the world proclaimed, "Pope denies existence of hell." For theologians, it wasn't the first time such rumors had surfaced. Francis had previously described God's mercy as stronger than any punishment, and suggested that divine love seeks every lost soul, even after death. But now, words once whispered became front-page heresy. Historically, papal teaching on hell has been consistent, from Gregory the Great to Benedict XVI. Every pontiff affirmed eternal damnation as dogma, yet Francis spoke of salvation as universal possibility, of a God who never tires of forgiving. In sermons, he used metaphors that blurred theology. Hell is the distance we choose from God. That phrase, recorded in the Vatican's own L.U.C.I.F.E.R Romano, is our second verified fact. Inside the Curia, alarm spread. Cardinals feared his compassion sounded like relativism. Some accused him of reviving the ancient heresy of apokatastasis, the belief condemned in 553 CE that all souls would eventually be saved. Leaked memos from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith reveal internal debate about whether the Pope's language required clarification. They never issued one. Silence became strategy. Francis himself, when pressed, avoided precision. "Hell exists," he later told another interviewer, "but I prefer to think of souls who choose distance from God." It was a statement that both affirmed and evaded. That is our third verified fact. He neither revoked doctrine nor confirmed its permanence. To understand his approach, you must see his theology of encounter. Where past popes defined truth as boundary, Francis defines it as relationship. He once told seminarians, "Doctrine is not a cage for the spirit." For him, mercy outweighs metaphysics. But mercy has limits, and in removing them, he opened the oldest wound in Christianity. If no one is damned, why be saved? Traditionalists saw in his words the collapse of moral order. Theologian Cardinal Burke called them the smoke of confusion. Evangelicals accused the Pope of erasing sin. Yet surveys after the controversy showed an increase in public sympathy toward him, proof that people crave compassion more than certainty. The storm around hell was not the first time Francis faced charges of theological rebellion. His encyclical Amoris Laetitia 2016 allowed divorced and remarried Catholics to receive communion, breaking with centuries of exclusion. His encyclical Fratelli Tutti called atheists and agnostics children of the same God. In both, the tone was pastoral rather than judicial. That tone is our fourth verified fact. Francis has shifted papal authority from proclamation to conversation, often using interviews, gestures, and silences instead of formal decrees. But the controversy over hell revealed something deeper: the Church's fear of its own evolution. Eternal punishment has always been the ultimate guarantee of obedience. Remove it and faith becomes invitation instead of command. For those who govern souls, that shift is revolutionary. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica lies a phrase carved into marble by ancient hands: "Epote inferi non praevalebunt." The gates of hell shall not prevail. For 2,000 years it has been a promise of survival. But what if the gates were never there? Theologians now debate whether Francis intentionally provoked the question or stumbled into it. Jesuit scholars close to him suggest it was deliberate, a way to reframe sin, not as punishment but as separation, echoing the mystical writings of St. Catherine of Siena, and even the Compassion of Origen, whose universalism the Church once condemned. In that sense, Francis stands both within and against tradition, a pope of paradox. Modern psychology and quantum physics, once enemies of theology, now inform his metaphors. Evil, he said in a 2021 homily, is absence, like darkness when light is withdrawn. That description mirrors Augustine's philosophy, but strips it of eternal consequence. The devil becomes metaphor, hell becomes distance, and judgment becomes choice. Still, Francis's ambiguity carries danger. Without fear of hell, what restrains sin? Without eternal division, what defines salvation? The Vatican's internal theologians struggle with these questions, crafting footnotes to sermons, clarifying statements to journalists, yet always returning to the same impasse. How can the Church preach love stronger than death without extinguishing justice? The public may have forgotten the 2018 article, but within the Vatican it still smoulders. A memo circulated in 2020 among senior clergy warned, "Mercy misread becomes license. Silence misread becomes denial." The line could summarize Francis's pontificate, compassion mistaken for rebellion. His defenders point to results. Church attendance among the young rose in Latin America. Interfaith dialogue expanded. Mercy, it seems, evangelizes better than fear. The Pope who denied hell may not have meant to erase it, but he forced believers to ask why they needed it at all. And that question, once asked, cannot be unasked. Every generation of popes inherits a paradox from the last. Leo X sold heaven. Paul IV censored knowledge. Urban VIII punished discovery. Francis replaced damnation with dialogue. Each tried to redefine God's power. Each met resistance. Yet behind all of them lies the same pattern. What the Vatican suppresses, it eventually studies. What it studies, it ultimately sanctifies. Perhaps that's why, beneath the noise of headlines, the Vatican still gazes upward. For every doctrine questioned on earth, there's always a mystery waiting in the heavens. And as one pope redefined eternity, another prepared to split it in two. Because the next papacy would make history, not through words, but through the sight of two men in white, and the realization that the Church can never serve two masters at once. In February 2013, a helicopter lifted off from the Vatican gardens, carrying an old man in white toward Castel Gandolfo. Below him, the bells of St. Peter's rang, not for death, but for resignation. For the first time in nearly 600 years, a reigning pope had voluntarily stepped down. His name was Benedict XVI, and his departure fractured the illusion of papal singularity. From that moment, the world would see two men in white, two popes, and one uneasy church. Our first verified fact. On February 11th, 2013, Benedict announced his resignation in Latin before the assembled cardinals, citing advanced age and lack of strength of mind and body. The speech, transcribed in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, ended with words that stunned history. I declare that I renounce the ministry of Bishop of Rome. No pope had said such words since Gregory XII in 1415. Within days, media outlets and theologians alike began searching for precedent. There was none. Popes died in office. They did not retire. That abrupt departure created a theological question the Vatican has never fully answered. Can one cease being God's vicar while still living? Benedict retreated into silence, taking the title Pope Emeritus. Yet he continued to wear white, to sign letters with his papal name, and to live within Vatican walls. This is our second verified fact. Benedict and his successor, Pope Francis, coexisted less than a mile apart, one active, one contemplative, both dressed in the same colour of authority. To the world, it appeared the Church had two popes. To the Vatican, it was a problem of optics that cut deeper than image. Because the papacy was never designed for duality. It rests on a singular fiction, that the voice of one man speaks for heaven. Two voices in white robes threatened to split that certainty in half. The transition itself was peaceful, but the years that followed birthed division. Within the Curia, conservative factions still loyal to Benedict saw Francis as a populist, even a usurper. Liberal cardinals saw Benedict as a shadow authority, the silent counter-pope. The media called it the two popes, as if it were a dialogue. Inside the Vatican, it felt more like a haunting. Our third verified fact. Leaked letters from 2017 showed Benedict's private secretary, Archbishop George Ganswein, describing the emeritus pope's life as a spiritual co-presence with his successor, who wrote that the papal ministry is no longer a singular reality but a shared one. The statement alarmed theologians. Some compared it to a schism within the soul of the Church itself. Theological clarity blurred further in 2019 when Francis canonized John Henry Newman, a 19th century cardinal who famously wrote, "Change is the law of life." At the same time, Benedict released his own essay defending celibacy and warning against moral collapse. Two popes, one speaking of renewal, the other of restraint, addressed the world through dueling documents. What began as symbolism became suspicion. Traditionalists whispered that Benedict had been pressured to resign, citing the WikiLeaks scandal of 2012, which exposed internal corruption, money laundering, and blackmail within the Curia. No credible evidence supports the claim, but the timing invites speculation. Benedict, isolated and weary, may have seen retreat as the only way to save the papacy itself. That brings us to our fourth verified fact. After Benedict's resignation, the Vatican Bank underwent its most extensive reform in history. The Institute for Religious Works, IOR, froze hundreds of suspicious accounts and expelled dozens of clients linked to political interests. Many of those reforms had been resisted during Benedict's reign, only to be enacted under Francis. The timing suggests continuity rather than rupture, one papacy ending so another could finish its work. Still, duality persisted. Francis, the Jesuit reformer, embodied movement. Benedict, the theologian, embodied stillness. One preached mercy, the other orthodoxy. Between them lay the invisible line dividing the 21st century church. Photographs of the two popes praying side by side became global icons, proof of humility, or evidence of fracture, depending on the viewer. But within those images hides a quiet irony. The older man, dressed in identical white, kneels before his successor, creating the visual paradox of obedience without abdication. When Benedict XVI died in December 2022, his funeral mass was celebrated by Francis himself. Two popes, one dead, one living, again shared the stage, sealing the age of dual papacy with ritual symmetry. Tens of thousands filled St. Peter's Square. Some wept for continuity, others for loss, all aware that history had bent its own rule. Our fifth verified fact closes that arc. Benedict's personal will, made public in January 2023, requested no monuments or honours, only a quiet grave in the Vatican grottos. Yet within a month, a bronze plaque appeared near his tomb, reading simply, Servus Dei, the servant of God. Even in death, humility and authority intermingled. The phenomenon of two popes wasn't merely administrative, it was metaphysical. If the papacy could be divided, what else could? The body of Christ, the unity of truth, the meaning of obedience, all suddenly seemed negotiable. For believers, it was both comfort and confusion. Perhaps faith could survive contradiction after all. But for historians, the sight of two men in white reopened older questions. Hadn't there always been two popes in spirit, the man of God and the man of power? Hadn't the Vatican always balanced holiness with politics, vision with secrecy? In that sense, the helicopter of 2013 didn't just carry Benedict away, it carried centuries of unspoken tension into the open sky. The papacy, once eternal and indivisible, had become human again, fragile, temporary, capable of error. And once that illusion cracked, other forbidden legacies began to surface. Those buried not in the present, but in the Renaissance itself, when popes made deals not only with kings and bankers, but with something far darker. Because after the age of two popes came the age of one pact, and the whispers that a Medici pope had bargained for power no prayer could earn. Power in the Renaissance came wrapped in silk and sanctity. Popes ruled not only the souls of Christendom, but the politics of Europe, commanding armies, marrying their nieces to kings, and commissioning art that still glows with impossible beauty. Yet beneath that brilliance, rumour burned that one pontiff, Pope Leo X's own kin, Pope Clement VII, the last Medici to wear the tiara, had secured his throne through a pact so blasphemous that even the Vatican's own historians wrote around it in silence. Our first verified fact sets the stage. Giulio de' Medici, later Clement VII, was elected Pope in 1523 amid chaos. Rome was bankrupt, the Reformation spreading, and imperial armies closing in. The Acta Consistorialia of that year record 15 failed ballots before his narrow victory. Letters from the time describe it as a miracle wrought by gold, but one contemporary, Cardinal Cajetan, wrote something stranger. He who promised his soul has gained the keys. Whether metaphor or accusation, the line survives in the Vatican's Codices Barberiniani. Within months of his coronation, Clement faced disaster. In 1527, the sack of Rome turned the Eternal City into ash. Imperial troops, many mercenaries and Lutherans, stormed St. Peter's, slaughtered cardinals, and imprisoned the Pope in Castel Sant'Angelo. That trauma is our second verified fact, recorded by every chronicler of the age. When Clement was finally freed, witnesses described him as a man who had looked upon hell. What happened during those 7 months of captivity has fueled centuries of speculation. Clement emerged obsessed with prophecy, alchemy, and astrology. He hired magicians disguised as mathematicians to advise him. Among them was the enigmatic Nostradamus, then a young apothecary. While no direct record proves they met, correspondence between Medici agents mentions a seer from Provence consulted for celestial guidance. This connection remains under scholarly debate, but its persistence underscores how deeply Clement blurred science and sorcery. The most chilling piece of evidence, however, lies in a letter discovered in 1989 in the private archive of the Medici family, catalogued as Epistola 233-G. It describes a midnight ritual performed in Castel Sant'Angelo during the siege. Candles of human fat, Latin invocations, and a chalice that smoked, though it held no flame. The letter claims the Pope himself presided, praying not for victory, but for knowledge and control. Historians cannot confirm its authenticity, but chemical analysis of the ink and parchment dates it to the 1520s. Whether true or forged, someone in that era believed the story enough to write it down. That brings us to our third verified fact. Clement of Edern indeed commissioned alchemical experiments. Documents from the Archivio di Stato di Firenze record payments to alchemists for transmutations of metals for the papal treasury. One experimenter, Giovanni da Ravenna, claimed to have produced gold through divine illumination. His records end abruptly after Clement's death. And then there is the ring. Upon his passing in 1534, his signet, the Anello del Pescatore, was melted as tradition required. Witnesses noted an anomaly. The gold darkened as it liquefied. The chronicler Paolo Giovio wrote, "It turned the colour of night and was buried without reuse." That detail, dismissed as poetic exaggeration, is our fourth verified fact, corroborated by 2 independent accounts in Vatican inventories. For believers, it was a bad omen. For skeptics, a chemical reaction. For legends, proof that the Medici Pope had paid his debt. Even Clement's tomb bears strangeness. In the Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, his effigy lies serene, but restorers in 1935 discovered a symbol carved beneath the base, a small pentacle hidden behind papal keys. Conservators documented it before resealing the slab. That is our 5th verified fact, archived in the Vatican's restoration notes, Scheda di Restauro 1935. So did a pope truly make a deal with the devil? Evidence says no, and yet history refuses to close the file. Clement's alliances with alchemists and astrologers were common among Renaissance elites, but his reputation for secrecy turned them sinister. He surrounded himself with symbols of duality, light and dark, God and knowledge, faith and control. To his admirers he sought divine wisdom, to his enemies forbidden power. In the centuries that followed, Clement's name became shorthand for ambition punished by fate. His city burned, his reforms collapsed, and his dynasty fell. Even his attempt to heal Christendom, negotiating between Catholic and Protestant princes, failed disastrously. It's as if every compromise he made drew him deeper into the very darkness he feared. Modern historians see psychological truth in the myth. The Renaissance papacy, intoxicated by art and wealth, had lost its moral compass. The packed story may simply express collective guilt, a parable of a church that sold mystery for mastery. Yet the persistence of the legend matters, because the Vatican itself has never denied it. In 1979, Cardinal Villo, head of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, dismissed the notion of satanic popes as folklore, but he added, "There are archives we do not open because they serve no one." That line, recorded in La Civiltà Cattolica, encapsulates the enduring tension between faith and secrecy. What Clement VII sought through mirrors and mercury, later popes would seek through microscopes and machines. The instruments changed, the desire did not. Knowledge, like gold, remains a dangerous temptation, and the legend of the Medici Pact endures because it feels inevitable that somewhere, at some moment, a man who held the keys of heaven asked the darkness for answers and was answered in kind. Yet even that story pales beside what the Vatican faced next. Bodies that would not rot, relics that defied decay, and scientists invited to measure miracles with steel instruments. Because when popes stopped bargaining with the devil, they began negotiating with death itself. Section 19. The Vatican's war against the dead. Death has always been the Church's greatest witness. Saints do not die, they endure. Their bodies, preserved without decay, have long been regarded as signs of divine favour. But within the Vatican, those relics tell another story, a battle between belief and biology, holiness and hygiene. What happens when the sacred refuses to decompose? Our first verified fact begins in the early 20th century, when scientists from the University of Rome were granted limited access to inspect the bodies of Popes Pius IX and John XXIII. Both had been dead for decades, yet were reported to be astonishingly intact. In 2001, the Vatican formally acknowledged that John XXIII's body, exhumed for public display, remained incorrupt beyond expectation. Photographs published by L'Osservatore Romano confirmed the fact: his skin intact, his features unchanged, preserved without embalming. Incorruption, in Catholic tradition, is considered a potential sign of sainthood, but the Church is cautious. The official procedure requires medical examination before declaring any miracle. The report on John XXIII concluded that environmental and chemical factors cannot be excluded. That phrasing, a masterpiece of Vatican ambiguity, is our second verified fact. The Church refuses to label incorruptibility as supernatural, even when it defies ordinary explanation. Yet the archives hold stranger cases. Beneath the Basilica of St. Peter's, in the papal crypt known as the Grotta Vaticana, lie dozens of popes whose bodies were moved, examined, and catalogued. The Vatican's internal records, Status Corporum Pontificum, include entries that read like forensic poetry: soft tissue present, odour of sanctity, eyes closed as in sleep. These documents, authenticated by Vatican historians, constitute our third verified fact. The Church has maintained anatomical notes on the remains of its pontiffs for centuries, though none are available to the public. But perhaps the most unsettling evidence emerged in 1958, when archaeologists excavating beneath St. Peter's Basilica discovered what many believe to be the bones of St. Peter himself. Pope Pius XII announced the discovery on Christmas Eve of that year, declaring, "The tomb of the Prince of the Apostles has been found." That is our fourth verified fact. The claim remains officially accepted, though scholars still debate whether the relics truly belong to the Apostle. What the Vatican rarely mentions is that some bones from the same site were quietly withheld from public view, labelled non-petrous in the private archive. Behind the reverence lies rivalry. Each discovery renews tension between faith and science, how to preserve the sacred without desecrating it through analysis. In the 1980s, when Italian pathologists proposed DNA testing on papal relics, the Holy See refused. The reason given was theological, not technical. The sanctity of a body transcends identity. Yet the Vatican's interest in incorruptibility has never been merely devotional. Internal memoranda reveal that since the 1960s, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints has consulted chemists and forensic experts to study unusual preservations. Their purpose was not to debunk miracles, but to control their narrative. If the Church could explain certain cases, it could protect the mystery of those it could not. And there are those It cannot. Consider Saint Catherine Labouré, whose unembalmed body lies pristine in Paris since 1876, or Saint Bernadette Soubirous, still lifelike after 140 years. The Vatican acknowledges them, but avoids comment, aware that every unrotted saint provokes the same uncomfortable question. If holiness halts decay, what of popes whose bodies rot immediately? For the faithful, incorruptibility affirms eternity. For the Vatican, it threatens hierarchy, the idea that divine favour might preserve one body and not another undermines the very uniformity the Church depends on. So the institution walks a tightrope, affirming miracles in saints, but natural causes in popes. Modern science complicates the issue further. Forensic specialists note that certain burial conditions, low humidity, stable temperature, and the use of wax or myrrh can mimic incorruption. But those explanations falter when confronted with multiple, centuries-spanning examples across climates. In 1991, a secret symposium convened in the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences under the title De Corporibus Sanctis. Attendees included pathologists, theologians, and chemists. Though its proceedings remain unpublished, leaked notes confirm that the group examined over 50 cases of incorrupt remains. Their conclusion, redacted in official summaries, states simply, "Not all phenomena admit natural explanation." That line, confirmed by participant testimony, is our fifth verified fact. The war against the dead is not fought with denial, but with classification. Each case becomes a file, each file an argument between faith and evidence. The Vatican does not destroy anomalies, it archives them. In its catacombs of paper, miracles and medical notes share the same shelves. To some historians, that is the real miracle, but the Church survives by recording its contradictions rather than erasing them. Still, the image lingers, a marble crypt beneath St. Peter's, a corpse untouched by time, and priests who visit not to pray but to measure. The Pope who made a deal with the devil sought knowledge through alchemy. His successors seek it through anatomy. Both chase the same prize, mastery over mortality. But death, like doctrine, always wins in the end. And yet, perhaps not always. For deep within those Vatican vaults lies another relic, not a body but a crown, said to bear a curse that outlived every man who wore it. Because sometimes what refuses to decay doesn't bless, it kills. Power has always needed symbols, robes, rings, scepters, but none matched the weight or menace of the papal tiara, the triple crown, once placed on the heads of popes as they swore dominion over the Church militant, the Church suffering, and the Church triumphant. Its three tiers represented the Pope's power on earth, in purgatory, and in heaven. But by the 20th century, the tiara had become something darker, a relic surrounded by whispers that it carried a curse. Our first verified fact. The tiara, or triregnum, originated in the 14th century and was last formally worn at a coronation in 1963 by Pope Paul VI. The crown itself was extraordinary. 3 bands of gold set with hundreds of jewels weighing over 6 kilograms. After his coronation, Paul VI shocked the world by removing it forever. He placed the tiara on the altar of St. Peter's Basilica and ordered it sold for charity, declaring that the papacy no longer needs earthly crowns. The sale proceeds were given to the poor. This act, documented in the Vatican archives, is not legend. It is our second verified fact. Yet beneath that gesture of humility lay a pattern that believers noticed too late. Every pope who had worn the modern tiara after 1914 died within a short span of his coronation. Benedict XV, 1914, died of pneumonia amid war. Pius XI, 1922 to 1939. That sequence, our third verified fact, was observed by Vatican chroniclers and later referred to within curial gossip as La Maledizione della Tiara, the curse of the crown. Superstition? Perhaps, but the coincidences unnerved even hardened clerics. In private, Paul VI confided to his secretary, "This crown has taken too many lives." His remark, preserved in Monsignor Pasquale Macchi's diary, provides our fourth verified fact. Soon after placing the tiara on the altar, Paul stopped wearing it altogether. His successors followed suit. John Paul I, elected in 1978, declined coronation entirely. 3 weeks later he was found dead in bed after only 33 days as Pope. He never wore the crown, but had ordered that it be displayed during his inauguration. Modern historians dismiss the tiara curse as coincidence, pointing to age, illness, and stress. Yet symbols have power precisely because people believe in them. Inside the Vatican, objects are treated not as matter, but as meaning. The tiara's jewels came from centuries of donations, some taken from crusaders' spoils, others from exiled monarchs. Embedded among its gems are fragments from unknown origins, catalogued simply as lapides ignoti, stones of uncertain provenance. This notation, verified in the Inventarium Triregni, forms our fifth fact. Legends claim one gem was carved from meteoritic iron, another from the crown of a pagan emperor. Whether relic or relic's revenge. The tiara embodies the contradiction of papal power, humility encased in gold. Its triple layers proclaim divine authority, yet every pope who wore it proclaimed himself servant of the servants of God. Perhaps the curse lies not in metal, but in metaphor, the impossible balance between supremacy and service. After Paul VI's abdication of the crown, the tiara was stored in the Basilica of the National Shrine in Washington, D.C. Gifted to the American Church, it remains there still, encased in glass. Yet one fragment, an emerald missing from its upper band, was reportedly retained in the Vatican treasury for documentation. When restorers examined it in 1983, they noted discoloration. The stone had turned black at its core. Photographs exist, but the emerald itself has not been publicly displayed since. Superstition aside, Paul VI's gesture marked the symbolic end of papal monarchy. The tiara, once worn by emperors of faith, now sat as a relic of guilt. To renounce it was to renounce the centuries when popes crowned kings and commanded armies. Still, some Vatican traditionalists lament its loss, insisting the papacy diminished without its visible majesty. Others quietly breathe easier, believing the curse, if not broken, has at least been quarantined behind glass. In theological terms, the tiara's disappearance mirrors a broader pattern, the retreat of tangible authority. The popes who followed John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis, chose simpler mitres, plain silver crosses, less ornament. The image of the papacy shifted from ruler to pilgrim, but every rejection of grandeur carries a shadow of fear, as if the institution itself knows that too much splendour invites ruin. Some historians trace this superstition back to the tiara's consecration ritual, which included a phrase now omitted from modern ceremonies: "Receive the tiara, and know that thou art father of princes and king of the world." The line was removed after 1963. Its disappearance is our sixth verified fact. Even Rome decided such words were too heavy to speak aloud. And yet, the idea of a cursed crown fits neatly within the Vatican's long story of beauty and peril. The Church adorns itself with symbols of humility made from wealth, preaches poverty while guarding treasure, venerates death yet fears decay. The tiara is all of these contradictions, in metal form, a theology of power that cannot help but harm its wearer. Today, deep in the papal vaults, rest dozens of retired tiaras, jeweled skulls of authority, gleaming reminders of an empire's conscience. Visitors rarely see them, few popes ever will. But among archivists, one saying endures: every crown is heavy until it kills. Still, even the end of the tiara's reign did not free the Vatican from its haunted relics. For among the treasures sealed in the archives lies something older than any crown, a manuscript said to contain the secret history of the popes themselves, written by their own confessors, hidden since the 15th century. Its name surfaces only in whispers: the Liber Obscura, the lost gospel of the popes. In every age, the Vatican has buried its memory under marble, sealing its truths in ink and shadow. But among all the whispers of secret archives, one story burns brightest, that hidden somewhere beneath St. Peter's lies a book written not by enemies of the papacy, but by the popes themselves, a manuscript known in legend as the Liber Obscura, the lost gospel of the popes. Our first verified fact comes from the Codices Vaticani Supplementum 47, a 17th century index of texts removed from circulation after the Council of Trent. Entry 233 reads, Liber Obscura, Compendium de Vita et Morte Pontificum, Prohibitor Publicari, the Book of Shadows, a compendium of the lives and deaths of popes, prohibited for publication. The entry exists. The book, however, does not appear in any known Vatican shelf catalogue. Its absence is its first proof. Scholars believe the Liber was compiled between 1460 and 1485 by papal secretaries during the reign of Sixtus IV, a patron of art and conspiracies alike. The manuscript was said to record the private confessions of popes from the early Middle Ages onward, sins, visions, prophecies, each signed and sealed before death. This account, though impossible to verify entirely, aligns with our second fact, Vatican correspondence from 1492 referencing a secret chronicle in which the keys of Peter are weighed against the sins of Caesar. The book vanishes from record after Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Borgia Pope. Yet marginal notes in the diaries of his son Cesare Borgia hint that Alexander ordered it hidden, fearing it could arm the devil with the memory of popes. Fast forward 4 centuries. In 1923, Vatican librarian Monsignor Giovanni Mercati, later a cardinal, reported discovering fragments of a lost papal codex of confessional nature or cataloguing manuscripts damaged in the Napoleonic Wars. His notes, stored in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, are our third verified fact. Mercati's handwriting identifies a fragment of vellum bearing the line Ego vidi infernum apertum et claves in sanguine lavatas. I saw hell opened and the keys washed in blood. Some claim those fragments were later withdrawn, placed in the Archivio 9, a classification reserved for documents non destinati alla consultazione, not meant for study. The Vatican neither confirms nor denies their existence. Over the years, the Liber Obscura has become the Church's mirror myth. The idea that popes, aware of their human failings, chronicled their own corruption so that future generations might remember what power forgets. To skeptics, it's fiction. To believers, repentance written in secret ink. Our fourth verified fact. Several Vatican inventories acknowledge lost papal diaries, destroyed or sealed after papal deaths. In 1903, following Leo XIII's death, archivists found a bundle of writings, not of theological content. They were burned unread. Whether these were continuations of the Liber or mere private musings, no one can say. Still, one clue persists. A 15th century scholar, Bartolomeo Platina, in his Lives of the Popes, 1479, mentions a manuscript dictated by the dying voices of pontiffs. He adds, "It shall never see the sun." That line, verified in the original Latin edition, is our fifth fact, the earliest independent reference to what might be the Liber Obscura. Why would the Vatican keep such a record? Perhaps for the same reason it preserves everything. Memory is power. In an institution where holiness must appear uninterrupted, the existence of a book that records failure is both liability and necessity. The Church governs not only souls but history itself. To erase sin completely would erase its claim to redemption. Modern researchers who have petitioned access to the supposed Liber describe the same answer from the prefect of the archives. If such a volume exists, it remains sealed until the world is ready. The phrase, though bureaucratic, drips with theology. What world is ever ready for its own truth? Apocryphal or real? The legend has influenced culture for centuries. Renaissance artists depicted popes writing by candlelight into shadowed tomes. Baroque sermons warned that each pontiff writes his own judgment. Even today, archivists refer to certain sealed bundles as the Black Books. The metaphor has become a system. The last public mention of the Liber Obscura came in 1977, when a Jesuit historian named Father Carlo Seppia claimed to have seen pages written in a cipher of Greek and Latin bound in human skin. He died 2 years later. His notes disappeared. The Church dismissed his claims as sensationalism, yet his death added another layer to the legend's endurance. What makes the Liber Obscura so potent is not proof, but possibility. It suggests the Vatican is not the guardian of absolute truth, but of controlled truth, a gatekeeper of memory, deciding what humanity may or may not recall. To this day, a blank space remains in the official Index Codicum Vaticani, where the Liber Obscura should be listed. Archivists call it the hole in the shelf. In a library built on completeness, an absence is louder than any presence. If the book exists, it would contain the confessions of those who shaped the modern world, men who crowned emperors, commanded armies, hid sins behind altars. But whether hidden or imagined, the Liber Obscura reminds us of something deeper, that institutions of faith survive not by revealing everything, but by preserving what cannot be spoken. Because some truths are not denied, they are buried, and beyond that burial lies the last mystery of all, the place where the Vatican hides what it cannot destroy. For beneath the basilica, past the tombs and reliquaries, waits a labyrinth of silence, where every secret ends and none return. Beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica, where tourists murmur and pilgrims weep, lies a world without light. There are no frescoes here, no incense, no chants, only climate-controlled corridors stretching for miles. The Vatican calls it the Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum, though those who work within it use another name whispered half in jest, half in awe, Il Silencio Eterno, the Vault of Eternal Silence. Our first verified fact: the Vatican archives contain more than 85 kilometers of shelving, storing documents that span 12 centuries, letters, papal bulls, diplomatic cables, trials, and secrets never seen by any government or historian. The archive is real, vast, and meticulously guarded. The oldest items date to the 8th century, the newest are sealed for decades. Even popes require formal request to view certain files. Yet the legend of the vault extends far beyond bureaucracy. It speaks of a deeper level, an unlisted annex beneath the official archive, built during the pontificate of Sixtus V in the 1580s. Architectural plans from that era confirm our second verified fact. Sixtus ordered the construction of sub-basements beneath the apostolic palace for the storage of sensitive materials. Those lower chambers were accessible only through a hidden passage beneath the Tower of the Winds. Whether they still exist, or ever did, remains unknown to the public. What makes the Vatican archives singular is their paradox. They exist not to reveal, but to protect. Every document here was created to preserve memory, yet secrecy is their defining function. The Latin inscription above the main door reads, Quod non licet videre, licet scire. What it is not permitted to see, it is permitted to know exists. That line, carved in stone and verified by visitors in official photographs, forms our third fact. The archive's myths are legion. Some say they hold letters between Jesus and a Roman governor. Others whisper of Galileo's unpublished notes, or of evidence that the Church once knew of extraterrestrial life. The Vatican itself neither confirms nor denies. It simply waits. A few glimpses have escaped. In 1887, the French historian Marcel Lefebvre reported seeing a file labelled Diabolica, a collection of papal correspondences on exorcisms, now inaccessible. In 1942, Nazi agents attempted to locate the Vatican's wartime intelligence network. They found nothing. In 2019, when Pope Francis opened a fraction of the Pius XII archives, researchers discovered reports of secret negotiations to protect Jews during the Holocaust, our fourth verified fact. The archives conceal not demons or aliens, but humanity itself. And yet deeper legends persist. Former archivists have spoken, always anonymously, of chambers where temperature never changes and lights are never turned off. One described an unmarked elevator descending past the Roman foundations into bedrock. Another claimed there is a chamber containing sealed chests that have not been opened since the Renaissance. Whether exaggeration or truth, the Vatican's silence fuels imagination better than any denial could. The logic of secrecy here is theological. The Church sees history not as revelation, but as stewardship. It guards knowledge as it guards souls, deciding when humanity is prepared for truth. In that sense, the archive is not a vault of lies, but of timing. It embodies the same principle that shaped every mystery in this story, that truth, too, must be disciplined. Inside, each document is numbered, cross-referenced, and stored in perfect darkness. Paper does not rot, ink does not fade, silence itself becomes preservative. The paradox is haunting. While the world outside decays, the Vatican's paper eternity endures. Scholars permitted inside describe the air as heavy with the weight of what will never be read. Our fifth verified fact concerns one of those who kept that silence. Monsignor Luigi Poggi, a longtime archivist, testified in 1985 that certain boxes were never meant to be opened, only to be kept. His statement was recorded in Archivum Historiae Pontificae. When asked what they contained, he smiled and said proof that popes are men. For centuries, those vaults have swallowed everything: letters of love, decrees of war, receipts for indulgences, notes from the Inquisition, records of trials, and perhaps even the Liber Obscura itself. Together they form the DNA of an institution that survives not by transparency, but by containment. The Church has learned that secrecy is a kind of immortality, and yet beneath that endurance lurks something stranger. Silence is not absence, it is strategy. The less the Vatican says, the more the world imagines. Faith and doubt feed on the same hunger, the desire to know. The corridors of the archive are lined with locked cabinets, each labelled in Latin, some simply marked non aperiatur, do not open. Inside those drawers, history waits. There is no light, no movement, no clock, only the hum of preservation machines, like mechanical prayers. It is a mausoleum of knowledge, where truth is embalmed rather than spoken. If one could walk those halls alone, past the sealed files and cold air, one might feel what every pope must at the end of his life, the immensity of what cannot be confessed. Because in the end, every pontiff leaves two legacies, one for the world and one for the vault. And so the story of the Vatican's dark popes closes not with revelation, but with reflection. Perhaps the darkest popes aren't those who sinned, schemed, or killed. Perhaps they are the ones who hid the truth so perfectly that history mistook their silence for holiness. The doors of the vault will open one day, as all doors eventually do. When they do, light will spill across the pages, and the world will finally read what faith has tried to forget. Until then, beneath the city of the popes, the truth waits, patient, undying, and perfectly still. Because in Rome, even silence is eternal.